Role changes aside, the plan stays the same from here. We keep heading towards Solium and do our best not to die along the way. Any objections? Only silence and nodding heads met Thistle's question. Then I say we get a good night of rest and set out in the morning, Thistle suggested. We're not quite running late, but we don't have time to dawdle. Plus, we should try and train a little on the way, Eric added, so we seem somewhat competent. In our fake skills, indeed, Thistle said, catching Grump's eye and giving a light shake of his head. They'd catch on in their own time. For now, there was dinner and sleep to attend to. 9. The next morning saw the party rising with the sun, having a quick breakfast composed primarily of more fruit, and packing up their bedrolls. The few possessions they had left Maplebark with had diminished even further, many of their things lost in the fire and chaos of the attack. Their packs, luckily, had been stored below the carts, so their basic necessities were still accounted for. Eric's armor had survived the fire as well, however, he elected to abandon it. It was part of his old life, and any sentimentality he might have held toward it was suppressed by the stomach-turning thought of strapping himself back into the cumbersome apparatus the goblins did there. Best to replace what they could, offering ponies and provisions for the journey ahead. The ponies were mostly declined, because even the hardiest of them would have broken under Grump's weight, though Thistle accepted one on the grounds that his normal gait would slow everyone else down. The provisions were also taken with thanks. Thistle was offered a set of goblin armor, since he was the only one that was small enough to wear any, but he declined and instead requested a pair of sturdy daggers, a matched set if possible. The goblins brought forth an array of their weapons, and eventually Thistle selected to that, while not actually a set, were close enough to fool a casual observer. With one last word of thanks and a promise to slow any Maplebark citizens that might come through the camp in pursuit, the goblins waved goodbye to the strange party that headed down the road to Appleroom. Once they'd been on the road for some time, Eric broke the silence that had seamlessly settled over them. I wanted to ask, why'd you turn down the armor? I thought you said you needed some. I likely do, Thistle agreed. But right now we're a rather bedraggled bunch. When we get to Appleroom, people will ask what happened. I intend to tell them the truth. We were kidnapped by goblins, and we fought our way free. That makes it sound like we fought the goblins, Gabrielle pointed out. Which is what I want them to infer, Thistle clarified. People get waylaid by goblins all the time. It won't raise a single eyebrow or prompt many questions, and that's what we want. Get in, resupply, get back on the road, and remain as unmemorable as possible. Why bother? Eric asked. Look, when we get to Solium with the scroll, there might be a bit of curiosity about us, but unless we give them a reason, they won't waste the magic to verify we're really the same adventurers who killed the kobolds. Appleroom, however, is close enough to Maplebark that if we make anyone too interested, they might take a leisurely ride back in this direction, a ride that would take them through Maplebark. And it wouldn't require more than 1 or 2 questions to piece together who we really are. That is, and I say this having known you for years, just amazingly paranoid, Gabrielle commented. Better paranoid than dead, Grump said, momentarily looking up from the spellbook he'd had his face buried in for hours. How he walked and read at the same time was a mystery to all of them, yet the lack of tripping clearly indicated that he had a system, and it worked. Precisely, old friend, Thistle agreed. Anyway, a few daggers and a pony can be explained away as things grabbed hastily. In battle, a set of armor is far more conspicuous, hence why I didn't accept the offer. If anyone asks why I'm an unarmored paladin, I'll just tell them a set of armor was one of the things we lost in the capture. We lost my set of armor, Eric said. What I said is still technically true, Thistle pointed out. "Oh yeah, now that you're a paladin. Does that mean you can't lie?" Gabrielle asked. "Different gods have different rules, given that minions constantly have to lie to their master, if only to assuage their egos and assure them they're brilliant and unbeatable. I doubt Grumpf objects much to an occasional fib. Still, I find lying to be more dangerous than expertly telling the truth, so I avoid it whenever possible. Whatever floats your galleon," Gabrielle said, adjusting the axe strapped to her back for the umpteenth time since setting out. The actual sheath was one of the things lost in the fire, so the goblins had rigged a makeshift sheath from a canvas grain sack and some leather straps. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't allow her to draw quickly, but it allowed her to heft the weapon along without tiring out her arms. Grumpf had offered to carry it for her, but Gabrielle's own paranoia had reminded her to stick to her role. She was the barbarian. She would carry her own axe. They continued on in near silence. After that, save for the clopping of Thistle's pony, each lost in the thoughts of what they were trying to do and how in the names of the gods they had any hope of accomplishing it. 2 days later, a party of adventurers wandered into Appleroom a few hours before sunset. 3 of them were on foot, while the 4th was mounted on a very weary-looking pony. Dust from the road coated their boots and pants, and wolf pelts were slung over the back of the pony, no doubt the glorious prize from a random encounter on the road. The quartet made a beeline for the local inn, which was also the tavern, where the pony was hitched and the gear quickly handed out. A blonde woman with a 2-handed axe strapped strangely to her back took the wolf carcasses, heading off toward the tannery with her male companion, while the half-orc and the gnome went inside the inn. On most days, this would have been a sight worth noting. Appleroom was a large town, easily the biggest one between Solium and Puro, the next kingdom south. But its townspeople were still interested in hearing tales from adventurers, and sometimes in negotiating services from them. That was most of the time. These days, nearly every villager of Appleroom who saw them lope through town had roughly the same reaction: "Ah shit." Not more of them, Grumpf and Thistle realized. Something was amiss as soon as they entered the tavern. This particular establishment, much like Grumpf's and many others throughout the land, utilized the downstairs floor for food and alcohol, while the upper floors were lodging rooms travelers could rent. Years of running an inn had taught Grumpf to expect a rush at dinner, a few constant customers at the bar, and occasional clusters of adventurers, once during a season where there was rumored to be a dragon in the area. There had been 3 parties in his tavern at the same time. But that was the most he'd ever seen. Walking in the door, Grumpf counted 7 distinct parties all huddled together at their own tables, many throwing suspicious glances at the others in the room. Any regulars that might have normally dined here had long since abandoned the room to the new patrons. Grumpf and Thistle were both assessed as soon as they walked in and dismissed just as quickly. Neither minded this in the slightest. Making their way to the bar, they passed a set of 5 humans, all of whom grew silent when they walked by. Whatever was going on, it seemed even those who were deemed not to be threats still weren't allowed within earshot. Thistle scrambled his way up a bar stool, clearly missing the rungs Grumpf had installed on his for the smaller customers, finally coming to a perch with only a minimum of embarrassment. He surveyed the tavern, making note of the strapping human behind the bar serving drinks, as well as the waitresses running to and fro around the tables. From their similar noses and eye color, not to mention the variety of ages, Thistle deduced they were either the bartender's daughters or some other close kin. He filed this away in case it would be of use later and turned his attention to ordering a drink. "To Meads, kind sir," Thistle called to the sizable fellow behind the bar, a man whose salt and pepper hair somehow made him seem more distinguished than aged. It was strange how every bartender seemed to convey a sense of toughness that 3-day-old kobold steak couldn't match, but Thistle had always taken it as simply one of those things. 1 silver, the bartender replied, drawing them each a mug from the barrel nearest to him. Thistle resisted the urge to raise an eyebrow, but only barely. That much for the drinks was outrageous. Clearly this man intended to get all he could from the influx of adventurers that had happened into his bar. With a quick motion, Thistle set a coin on the bar, which the large man promptly scooped up. "I was also hoping to find some lodging tonight," Thistle added, taking a quick nip from the mug in front of him. It was tolerable. He'd have even thought it good if not for years of drinking Grump's home brews. "Got 2 rooms left, going for 20 gold apiece," the bartender informed him. If getting backup wouldn't have been such an issue, Thistle would have fallen out of his chair just to make a point. 20 gold apiece was ludicrous, beyond mere gouging and well into outright theft. Before he could voice that opinion, Grump set the mug he'd been draining on the table with an audible thud. "Too weak," Grump announced, meeting the bartender's immediately incredulous eyes. "Good process, poor ingredients, where you get your hops." Thistle quickly noticed that Grump had affected his ignorant half-orc speech pattern. It mostly consisted of growling at the end of sentences and leaving out unimportant words. Base as it was, the tactic was effective for getting people to underestimate his intelligence. Plus, and Thistle hated to admit this, it would make Grump less memorable, which was a big priority. Everyone expected half-orcs to be dumb, so this would make him as uninteresting as the tables or stools. "I'll have you know, I buy my hops from one of the top solium grain merchants, and he sells me the abstanial silver," the bartender announced proudly. "No," Grump rumbled. "No what?" "Abstanial silver brew tart, but with undertone of pine. This have undertone of nut. It's Grebthan silver," Grump informed him. "Look, almost the same. Yours have occasional veins of red in leaves." "Actually, yes," the bartender admitted. "Grebthan silver. Abstanial has no veins." "Merchant is cheating you. That Weasley little son of shit," the bartender cursed. "I'm going to wring his neck next time I see him." "You're sure about this?" Grump nodded. "Had one try to pull same trick on me. Got good guy now. I'll give you his name." Bartenders have to look out for one another. "Oh, you're a bartender too." The man stuck his hand out to Grump. "Bertrand." "Pleasure to meet you, Grump." The handshake was delicate since both were clearly strong men and neither wished to hurt their new friend. Thistle took the opportunity to slip quietly off his stool and make for the door, mumbling something about using the outhouse. Grump was clearly working his own angle. Thistle's presence would merely get in the way. Besides, he had to think of a new place for them to regroup. The last thing they needed right now was for someone to see all 4 of them together and realize that there were really 8 parties here. Better to gather away from prying eyes. Hopefully, in the meantime, Grump would be able to get some less exorbitant rates on a place to stay. An hour later, Eric and Gabrielle were shown into the tavern's back room by one of the many waitresses. Grump and Thistle were already there, working their way through bowls of stew that, after days of nothing but trail rations, may as well as have been made by the gods themselves. Gabrielle let out a low whistle. "Hope you didn't splurge too much on a private dining room." "Those pelts didn't fetch as much as we were hoping for. 1 gold, Eric added before anyone could ask. He set the single coin on the table to show the meager haul, and that was with half an hour of haggling. Merchant said they're swamped with stuff. Evidently, there are a bunch of adventurers here, and they've been killing every wild beast for miles in their downtime. I thought he was blowing smoke until I saw the tavern," Gabrielle explained. "By the way, why did that girl greet me as the new applicant?" I didn't want to draw suspicion about you to following us to the back room, Thistle explained. Ostensibly, we're back here so Grumph can pass on a few trade secrets to Bertrand, the bartender. In reality, their shared occupation and a few actual trade secrets got him to lease us one of the servants' quarters for far less than the rooms upstairs. How much did he want for an upstairs room? Eric asked, looking around with a keen eye and noticing the sparse decor and old straw bundles. 20 gold. Grumph rumbled. Dragon shit, Gabrielle snapped. Sit down, eat, and I'll explain, Thistle said, motioning to the table. The humans took the cue and sat, filling their bowls quickly. Once that was done, Thistle continued. Evidently, the last governor of Applerum noticed the high flow of adventurers heading to Solium over the last few weeks and decided to get his hands on a bit of their coin. He's holding a tournament in 2 days, one with fairly respectable caches of gold as prizes. All these adventurers are here to compete, and in the meantime, the town is bleeding them dry for every meal, night of sleep, and tool they purchase. I presume that's why the tannery was overstocked. They're trying to make enough coin to last until the tournament. Smart, Eric commented, tearing into a piece of overcooked chicken he spooned up from the stew. Both he and you. Good way to make money. And since you managed to negotiate a decent rate, we can just hit the road again tomorrow. Yes, about that. I said Grumph got us a better rate, not a good one, Thistle clarified. How much do we have left? Gabrielle asked. Well, as of right now, Thistle said, picking up the coin from the table. 1 gold. What? The ferocity of Gabrielle's yell was only matched by the strength in her grip as her hand grasped her axe. That's insane. Calm down, Grumph told her. It's a good deal. How is that a good deal? Because he easily could have made 20 times that, and fully intended to, Thistle told her. He's not likely to see a chance to make this kind of money again for years, if ever. Bertrand has done us a tremendous kindness by allowing us to stay here at such a paltry rate. We could have slept outside, Eric pointed out. We've been doing it for days. Now, there's a sizable flaw in that plan, Thistle told him. Right now we have an exceptionally high concentration of adventurers. I don't have to tell you how dangerous that makes being outside of town. We're lucky we arrived in the day and that they've been going out to hunt. Otherwise, we'd likely be dead already, Eric nodded. No one understood why, but the more adventurers were around, the greater the number of monsters that were drawn. It was like they grouped up in scale to the number of adventurers present to give a proper challenge. That's it. You traded all our money for 1 night of lodging and a pot of stew. Gabrielle asked, sitting back down. The flash of anger that had bubbled up had subsided, though she was surprised to have even felt it in the first place. She'd been raised to keep an even temper, as a proper lady should. These bursts of fury were a new and not entirely welcome occurrence. Don't be silly. I traded it for 3 nights of lodging and 3 meals each day, Thistle said. We're not even going to be here 3 nights, Eric pointed out. Actually, we are, Thistle corrected him. We can't very well walk into Solium like this. No one would believe we beat a wild badger, let alone a kobold invasion. We require equipment that makes us look at least reasonably respectable, and for that we'll need money. Money that you spent, Gabrielle muttered. Money I invested. What we had wouldn't have gotten us a decent buckler, let alone outfitted us all, Thistle said. Now we need to make some real coin, and fast. Which leaves us with only one viable option. You have got to be joking, Eric said, filling in the gaps before Thistle could say it. I am completely serious, Thistle replied. The 4 of us are entering Applerum's tournament. 10. Thistle slurped down some stew while he waited for Eric and Gabrielle's flurry of objections to die down. Even if he'd wanted to address them, there was no way he'd be able to with the speed at which they were speaking. Instead, he filled his belly and sat in silence until they realized he wasn't going to speak until they ceased yelling. It took longer than he expected, which worked out well. He was still quite hungry, and it was impolite to eat when talking. When silence finally reigned over the table once more, Thistle continued, "We don't have an option. I know I said we should lay low here, but that was before I realized the situation. This is actually better. If we can put on a good showing at the tournament, it will lend our story credence. And if anyone from the kingdom does any investigating, they'll hear about our party's deeds in Apple Room." The key word was "if we put on a good showing," Eric said. "Did you forget that we don't have any idea what we're doing?" "No, I didn't," Thistle said, "but we do have some skills and 2 days to train. Plus, there are 6 events, and admission is free for 1 event per adventurer. No doubt a ploy by the mayor to keep people from thinking about how much their food and lodging is costing." "What are the events?" Gabrielle asked. This plan was crazy, but Thistle rarely did things without thinking them through. Besides, their whole idea had been crazy from the get-go. "Why should this part be any different?" "Glad you asked," Thistle said. 6 events are being held: sword fighting, archery, dagger throwing, feats of strength, general melee, and magical duels. "I would have expected a joust," Eric commented. "Not outside of a royal tournament. Most real adventurers aren't that skilled in mounted combat. You seem to know quite a bit about adventurers, Thistle," Gabrielle said. There was no malice in her tone, no wheedling waves in her words, yet they still halted the conversation effectively. Eric and Gabrielle, heck, all of Maple Bark had known that Thistle's past was more interesting than he let on. No one commented, no one probed. It was just one of those things. Strangely, the longer they wore the mantle of adventurers, the less normal one of those things seemed. The world didn't make much sense. And like a lost man stumbling out of the fog, they were beginning to notice the details around them. That I do," Thistle agreed. "And maybe I'll tell you that story one day. But it won't be here, and it won't be now. We've got more important things on our plate." "I apologize," Gabrielle said, although this time her tone made it clear that her words were only that, words, no need. It's natural to be curious, but there is a time and place for such things. Anyway, you were saying about the events. Eric probed, eager to change the subject and ameliorate some of the tension in the room. The events. I've got a decent hand at throwing daggers, so I'll enter that one." "Eric, are you better with a sword or a bow?" "Sword," Grumph grunted. "He's right," Eric admitted, "sword. When I was trying to learn the bow, I broke 3 of the windows on Grumph's tavern." "That's pretty impressive," Thistle noted. "Not really. I was aiming for a target in the grove of trees off to the side." Thistle knew the forest Eric was speaking of. "It was nowhere near Grumph's windows." "Sword it is," Thistle announced. "I don't have my armor, don't worry." "You'll be using wooden tourney swords," Thistle assured him. "Besides, I think you're better off without it." Eric couldn't argue with that logic, so instead he merely gave a nod and turned his attention toward his meal. "Next up, Grumph, I dare say you've got a real shot at winning the feats of strength event, old friend." "True," Grumph agreed. "But I'm in magical duels. Come on, Grumph. Do the one you can win." "We need the money," Gabrielle wheedled. "We need practice," Grumph countered, his thick, rumbling voice moving far more fluidly than it did around those he didn't trust. "Experience is worth more than gold." "Very well then. Grumph is doing the magical duels," Thistle said. He personally agreed with Gabrielle. However, he knew Grumph well enough to understand that when the half-orc was set on something, it would take an act of the gods to deter him. "Gabby, that just leaves you. I might be able to do okay at archery," she replied. I was decent at it, not great, but decent, General Melee Grumph said. I hate to say it, but I agree with Grumph, Eric added before Gabrielle's mouth could voice the objection she clearly felt. He's right, we do need the practice. When are you going to get the chance to fight seasoned warriors without risking getting killed? Plus, I've seen you shoot a bow. You're better than I am, but that's not saying much. Do the event, where you'll at least learn something. Gabby, to be clear, General Melee will use wooden weaponry as well. However, they will still be swung hard and broken bones are not unheard of, Thistle told her. I won't ask you to register in an event you're uncomfortable with. If you say archery, then it's archery. The choice is yours. Though Gabrielle was surrounded by silence once the question was asked, she could still clearly hear voices. They were the corrective tones of her father, the mayor, and her mother, the socialite. The voices were firm, admonishing her for even considering such a course of action. Proper ladies did not enter brawls. Proper ladies did not swing axes about their heads. Proper ladies did not adventure. How did she ever hope to catch the eye of one of the royals from Solium if she continued pursuing these stupid endeavors? Her mouth opened a fraction of an inch, ready to say the word archery, when another chorus of voices echoed through her mind. These spoke Goblik and told her that she was a good tracker, which she'd shown herself to be. She was good at gutting the captured animals and skinning their hides, a task the goblins had taught her, and that she'd picked up quickly. And this voice was the quietest, yet someone she heard with the most force. She was a brave warrior who had saved many goblins with her blade. No, General Melee was not a sport for proper ladies, but she'd been engaging in those sorts of activities for years already. She'd straddled the line, living publicly as the mayor's daughter and living in the forest as an honorary goblin. The line was growing wider now, the division between the two greater. She was going to have to choose which Gabrielle was the one she truly wanted to be, and while this might not be the point of no return, it would mark the first conscious step in that journey. General Melee, Gabrielle announced, her voice filled with more conviction than she actually felt. Are you certain? Thistle asked. Yes, I am, she told him, and with that, she was. Her parents weren't here to make happy. Her friends didn't care which she chose. For once, the only one she had to please with her decision was herself, and the truth was, Gabrielle had been far happier as a pretend goblin than a pretend proper lady. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. Very well, then. First thing tomorrow, I'll get us registered. Grumph is going to see if Bertrand can get the other vendors in town to sell us equipment at somewhat decent rates. And you two are free to do what you wish. We'll all meet at the training grounds for practice, Thistle instructed. Won't the other parties be there? Eric asked. Almost. Certainly, Thistle confirmed. Don't worry about them. Just work your hardest to improve in the time before the tournament. They'll be more concerned with their own skill sharpening than sizing us up. Despite knowing his policy on truth versus falsehood, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that Thistle had just told them all one hell of a lie. The training area was set up where the tournament would actually be held, since putting together two structures to serve the same purpose would be at the level of idiotic redundancy reserved for the highest halls of government. True, many of the banners were still furled and the decorations had yet to be unveiled, but the bare bones of the tournament grounds were there, wooden weapons, targets, and fenced-off areas for sparring. There were no arrows or magical tools, because those were prone to breaking or being used up, and were therefore sold. By the shops in town, Thistle was the first to arrive. Registration had taken less time than he expected. All he needed to do was provide names and which events each person was entering. The clerk had been profoundly disappointed that none of them would be paying for the privilege to compete in additional events, an attitude made clear by his constant reminders that the more one competed, the more they could win. The gnome didn't begrudge the clerk his attempts to gain a little extra coin, but he became quickly tiresome. He made his exit and headed over to the training area to survey it himself. On the whole, he was impressed. Appleroom didn't have much tradition of sported combat, but they'd put together a respectable arena. It wasn't as fancy as one might see in Solium. However, in a way, that appealed to Thistle more. He preferred the simple, genuine attempts rather than gilded fluff. It was why he'd settled in Maple Bark after all. Since there were no other competitors present yet, Thistle decided to squeeze in some extra practice. Having only 2 daggers made the throwing process a bit tiresome. He would hurl both, then shuffle across the dusty ground to the target, yank the daggers out, and drag himself all the way back. By the 4th round, he was expecting his body to protest, years of experience telling him this was as much motion as he could complete without pain. Strangely, the soreness didn't come. Rounds 5, 6, and 7 passed, all without so much as a twinge. It was not until round 8, when he accidentally threw one of his daggers with too much force and wedged it halfway into the thick wood of the target, that Thistle remembered his new job was supposed to give him greater strength and endurance. With a concentrated effort, he chunked his 2nd dagger into the target, this time actually causing a small part of it to crack. Thistle wore a subdued smile as he made his way across the arena to retrieve them. The title of Paladin might not come with a long job expectancy or much of a social life, but he had to admit that he didn't mind the fringe benefits. Gabrielle and Eric arrived next. After a few moments' discussion, they each picked up wooden versions of their usual weapons and headed off to one of the sparring rings. Since both would be engaged in martial combat, it made sense for them to train against one another. The first few rounds were more of a dance than a fight, light tapping that only ended when someone called the other as out or one admitted defeat. Each was getting accustomed to the new weight and shape of their wooden weapons. The trees around Appleroom were notorious for the dense, sturdy wood they produce. While not as heavy as a normal sword or axe, these definitely had more heft than if they'd been made out of the same materials as the targets. As they settled into the flow of combat and grew more comfortable striking each other, the fights quickly became an exercise in frustration for Gabrielle. Eric, slow, clumsy, ineffective Eric, became increasingly more difficult to hit. Freed from the weight of armor, he'd never been strong enough to bear. Eric's grace was a thing of strange beauty. He moved effortlessly around her faux blade, slipping to the side of each strike with inches of space to spare, then slashing her across the arms or stomach. True, his lack of strength meant the blows weren't terribly forceful, but that wouldn't have stopped a real sword from opening up some serious wounds on her. With each round Eric won, Gabrielle's frustrations grew. How was he so good? She managed to forget that he'd been forced to train regularly with the other guards for the past several years, instead focusing on how unfair it was that he vanished like a whisper in a crowd every time she swung toward him. The breaking point came after she saw his heel catch on the ground and seized the chance to attack. Gabrielle swung high and wide, giving it all she had, sure this was the time she'd win. Somehow, Eric recovered his footing and dodged the blow, circling around in the same fluid motion and pressing his wooden short sword against the back of her neck. "Got you," Eric said, his voice perfectly calm. It was the way he said it that got her. If he'd been glib or taunting, she could have dealt with it. But no, Eric said it as though he were stating the weather, as though it were an obvious fact. Of course he won, because he was just so damned much better than her. Gabrielle knew he said something after that, but she couldn't make out the words over the sudden pounding in her ears. Her grip on the fake axe's shaft grew so strong that the sturdy wood creaked. Without thought or warning, she spun around, weapon pulled back. Though in the moment, she ignored it, she would never forget the look of sudden terror in Eric's eyes as she faced him. It would plague her for years to come. She released a guttural yell and struck. With all her suddenly considerable might, the blow nearly landed true, a blow that would have shattered Eric's arm and shoulder at the very least. At the last moment, however, she felt her entire body be jerked back, throwing the blow wild and smashing the wooden axe into the dusty ground. Gabrielle was lifted off her feet, arms pinned to her sides as she thrashed about wildly. It took a few minutes, but eventually her anger subsided enough for coherent thought to return. For the first time, she realized that the arms holding her belonged to a half-orc, and from there it didn't take much thought to put things together. I'm okay now, Grumph, Gabrielle said shakily. What in the seven hells was that? Eric asked. Side effect, Grumph said before Gabrielle could answer. Go practice alone. We need to talk. Eric nodded his understanding and jogged off toward one of the human-sized dummies set up near one end of the arena. Once he was gone, Grumph's grip loosened, and he set his friend carefully down on the ground. I don't know what happened, she said, shocked by how hard it was to get her legs to bear her weight. I do, Grumph replied. Follow me. With that, he headed off, away from the arena, past a few of the other adventurers who had wandered in to train and toward an outcropping of trees not quite dense enough to be considered part of the forest. Part of Gabrielle wondered why he was leaving the arena. However, a much larger part wondered what was going on inside her. That was the question that begged answering, and soon. Taking a few deep breaths and making sure she could move under her own power, Gabrielle followed her half-orc friend to the woods. The arrival of other adventurers had forced Thistle to switch up his training tactics. He was still throwing his daggers, still trundling across the wide expanse of land to retrieve them, and still walking all the way back to throw again. What was different, now that others were also there, was that Thistle was missing. It was a simple strategy, really. Instead of aiming for the center of the target, Thistle would aim for a spot closer to the outer edge. He'd change spots each time, throwing one in the center on occasion, two just to keep it. Interesting. In this way, he was still working on putting the dagger exactly where he wanted it, but to an observer, it would appear his throws were all over the place. Despite knowing he'd be putting on a show for these people in a few days' time, laying low was too ingrained in Thistle's nature to buck against it. Nice throw, said a female voice from behind him. Thistle turned to see a half-elf woman walking forward until she was parallel with him, perfectly situated to throw at the nearest adjacent target. She was quite pretty, if he went in for that sort of thing, with lavender eyes and golden hair, not to mention a body accentuated nicely by the tight leather armor wrapped around her. One of the better ones of the day, Thistle replied, hobbling to the target to retrieve his daggers. This one had landed close to the center, so he made a note to ensure the next several were thrown at the edge. Hope you get more of them, the woman replied. She pulled a pair of her own daggers from sheaths at her side, long, silver beauties with intricate carvings across their mirror-like surfaces. A quick motion from each arm, and the blades were buried on either side of the target's bullseye. Not too shabby yourself, Thistle complimented. I try. The woman let out a low whistle and both daggers glowed lightly, vanished, and then reappeared in their sheaths at her side. Handy trick. Thistle sent his own blades into the high and low edges of the target. Daggers with a calling spell are the only way to go. I'm Serva, by the way, Thistle replied, once his journey to and from the target was complete. Pleasure to meet you. Looks like we'll be competing against one another, Serva noted. "Aye, so it does. This time." Thistle watched her as she whipped the daggers through the air and sent them quivering into the target. Both landed close to the bullseye, but neither actually hit it. This would have been a more comforting observation, if not for the fact that Serva's eyes had never focused on the bullseye in the first place. She was using his same strategy, purposely missing in order to appear more inept. What was more, given how many empty targets were around, she likely caught onto the fact that he was doing it, too. That was why she'd greeted him and gotten close enough to be observed. She wanted him to know she'd caught onto his trickery. Thistle smiled as he took aim and let the first of his own daggers fly. He'd been worried things would get boring, but it seemed he might have a little fun at this tournament after all. Unlike Thistle, Eric wasn't particularly interesting to the other adventurers who wandered into his area of the training arena. Most of them seemed to stick together, whispering when others came by. A few of them shot Eric looks, suspiciously gauging whether he was a danger, but after watching him smack the dummy around, they lost interest. He couldn't really blame them. He knew he didn't look the part of a fellow adventurer. They were all decked out in well-made clothes and fitted armor, while Eric was wearing a homemade tunic and pants, along with shoes that were barely holding together. His mother had taught him to patch his clothing, though in the rush to get out of town, he hadn't thought to bring along any sewing implements. Hopefully, his footwear would hold out until at least after the tournament. If even one of them won, it would provide enough to equip themselves with the necessities. Eric took a break to catch his breath and watched a few of the other groups sparring. Most of them were good, but not spectacular. A few he felt sure he could actually win against. There was the occasional rarity, though, warriors in armor that nearly hummed with magic and who struck each other with such power that the dust behind them was blown away. One was a dwarf, swinging a club nearly the size of him. Another was human, longsword dancing lightly in his hands. When Eric looked at these competitors, he felt a hot stone of certainty in his gut. That, if one in his group did win, it wasn't going to be him or Gabriel. Even if they had even odds against the bulk of the others, one of those two he was watching spar would likely be walking away with the win. Eric took up his wooden sword once more and began training, determination renewed. Maybe the impressive contenders would both go to general melee, in which case his party would be counting on him to win some prize money from sword fighting. It was like the leader of the guards had always said, in a real battle, anything can happen. He'd meant it as a caution to be prepared for whatever their opponent might throw at them, but Eric had gleaned a different meaning from those words. To him, it meant that no matter how difficult an opponent might be, there was always a chance. Eric intended to make the most of that chance if it was presented to him. The grove Grumph brought Gabriel into wasn't particularly peaceful. Nearby sounds of battle still echoed from the training area, bouncing off the trees. Still, the shade, greenery, and distance from others did help Gabriel calm down. For the life of her, she couldn't imagine why she'd snapped at Eric like that. Gabriel was on the verge of telling Grumph to forget everything, that it had been a fluke when he spoke. "You've had anger for a long time," he said simply. Rough voice brought down softer than she'd expected. "No, just since the goblin camp," she replied. Grumph shook his head. "Years, always angry. Unhappy with your life, unhappy with your place in the world. Anger boils constantly, builds pressure as time goes by. Anger didn't begin at goblin camp. That was when anger broke free. It was more than Gabriel had ever heard him speak at once. Grumph always kept things short, simple, and concise. That fact alone impressed upon her the importance of what he was trying to convey to her. Besides, hadn't she just admitted to herself that she'd been trying to live two lives, being forced to compromise pieces of herself nearly every day? Maybe that sort of thing had worn on her more than she'd let herself realize. "But I've never had a temper before," Gabriel pointed out. Sarcasm, biting words, fierce tones, you kept it sealed, released only in small spurts. That still doesn't explain why I've got one now, though. If I have barrel of mead with a spout, I control how much mead comes out, Grumph told her. If I kick open a hole, mead comes out as it sees fit. Spout is no help anymore. You broke open your sealed anger when you saw the goblins dying. Now it is flowing out when it chooses. Fine, if, and this is definitely an if, but if I accept that idea, how do I fix it? A broken barrel cannot be fixed unless mead is emptied. I don't know how to empty a person of anger, Grumph admitted. Fixing is off the table for now, so we have to work with next best thing. What's that? Learning to aim, Grumph told her, a slight smile creeping across his wide, hairy face. 11. The day of the tournament was a gorgeous one, sun shining brightly overhead and not a single cloud in the sky. Of course, this was the worst possible weather for the competitors. It meant glares of light in the eye from every reflective surface and stifling heat for those equipped with armor. Despite this, spirits were high as the various parties wandered into the arena. Unlike on the days of training, all the decorations had been set up and unfurled the previous evening. Large banners, sizable signs, and endless knickknacks were positioned all over the arena, while at a royal tournament, these would have shown the standards of great houses or of the warriors for whom various groups were cheering for. Here nearly all of them were advertisements for various stalls and vendors in town. One for the local herbalist, showing a wounded knight being magically healed, would prove to be particularly well-targeted advertising by the day's end. Another notable difference from the days before was the people in attendance. A peasant or two had wandered by the training grounds on days prior, though the vast majority of them were working or manning shops in order to squeeze every coin they could from the adventurers. Now that their cash cows were otherwise occupied, it made all the sense in the world to come watch a free show. After all, they'd put in a lot of work over the last week. They deserved a day off. The mood in the stands was festive, buoyant even, as locals with more gold under their mattresses than they'd ever had before kicked back to be entertained. A few die-hard entrepreneurs were walking through the stands selling mead and meat, though pointedly not calling out prices. They wouldn't want an adventurer to overhear how much things really cost. Near the center, in a part of the stands slightly sectioned off, was the mayor of Appleram and his two children. Despite his high office, Mayor Branders still worked his farm daily, leaving him a muscular man with a sun-beaten face. The young boy and girl scrambling about energetically had similar features to his, but theirs were turned up in smiles and glowing with excitement. They raced alongside the railings, pointing to each new adventurer who entered the arena, frantically speculating about what their events were and how they would do. The mayor's children were far from the only ones doing some speculating. A buzz swept through the crowds any time an adventurer did so much as stretch their back. Bets on who would win, what events were made and taken in covert gestures and secret handoffs. Many made their guesses based on the interactions they'd had with the adventurers during the week, while others used physical stature as their betting benchmarks. And still a third camp had made their speculations based entirely on the quality of the armor an individual was wearing. Due to this third camp, there was already heavy money riding on the party Eric had watched during his training, and more would certainly be added to that sum as the day wore on. One group, on whom no one had placed even a single copper coin, was the party containing a human female wearing a large axe, a half-orc clutching a spell book, a crook gnome fiddling with a pair of goblin-made daggers, and a human male with a hole in the left heel of his shoes. Truthfully, Their drab equipment didn't stand out as much as their motley assortment of races, and even that wasn't terribly divergent from the other groups. Many of the other parties had a similar quality of gear and more than one race of warrior in their arsenal. What set this group apart was the simple truth that they appeared to have no idea what they were doing, as they wandered around the arena muttering to themselves. The other parties were warming up, doing some mock sparring, or just posing for the crowd. These four merely kept to themselves, tried to stay out of everyone else's way, and waited for the events to begin. They did not have to wait long. The mayor soon rose from his seat and walked to the edge of the railing. The crowd immediately grew still. Even his children subdued themselves. Mayor Branders was not a violent man, nor did he have a proclivity to raise his voice, but there was something about the way he moved and how his eyes gauged everyone he met that spoke of more power than he let on. He was like a pot of simmering silver, simple and serene to look at, but with a scalding danger waiting beneath the surface. Citizens of Applerum, travelers and brave adventurers, I thank you for joining in our humble festival. Even without magical aid, his words carried across the arena. Effortlessly, Mayor Branders was a man who was seldom, if ever, asked to repeat himself. I'm not a bard, so I'll be quick. Good luck to all the competitors. Battle with honor and dignity, and no cheating. Though the last two words were pronounced the same tone as the others, they rang powerfully in the ears of each person present. We shall begin with dagger throwing. All those signed up to compete, to the targets at the west of the arena. Everyone else, stay clear. Words spent, Mayor Branders walked back to his chair and sat, while in the arena, adventurers scurried toward or away from the arena's western side. Within moments, it had filled with competitors of various shapes and sizes, each holding their daggers at the ready. The tournament had begun. The rules for the dagger throwing event are simple, yelled the portly man standing between the gathered contestants and the targets. We will have 5 rounds. Each competitor will throw 1 dagger each round. The closer you get to the bullseye, the better you score that round. I'll watch and keep tally, and the highest score at the end of the final round wins. Oh, and there's one more thing. If during any round you miss the target entirely, you are immediately disqualified from the competition regardless of score. His wide face broke into an unashamed grin. We thought that would keep it interesting. With that, he walked toward a wide table, and a flurry of other peasants rushed to set up the first targets. Scenes were neighbors again. Thistle, Serva stepped forward from the still milling crowd, taking the spot to his right. Most of the competitors had waited to see who went where, wanting a place where they wouldn't feel crowded or overshadowed by the grandeur of their competitor. Thistle, on the other hand, had stalked his spot immediately upon arrival. It would be too easy to get knocked about if he tried to jostle through the crowd. Quite a coincidence, though a pleasant one, Thistle replied politely. Of course, since she'd chosen that spot, it was really anything but coincidence, but propriety was propriety. Tell me, what do you think of that last rule? The immediate disqualification if one misses, I'd say the reasonable assumption is that anyone who misses completely is likely to far behind in points to have a chance at placing, so pulling them out saves everyone's time, Thistle proposed. Perhaps, though it seems a shame to rob them of a chance to regain ground, Serva commented. You have another thought, more of a tickle of suspicion than a full thought, Serva admitted. It just strikes me as off, but I can't think of why it bothers me. Well, if I were a less trusting and far more paranoid individual, I might have an inkling to offer, Thistle said, both volume and tone carefully controlled. Whether it was his years of henching, his amount of exposure to heroes, or some secret paladin sense, Thistle had a hunch that Serva was a good person. Certainly, she might beat him, but that was the nature of competition. A little information now could equal a favor later, and Thistle was fond of having useful people in his debt. And what might that be if you were indeed cursed with a suspicious heart? Her eyes didn't linger on him. Instead, they watched the targets being set up. To a casual observer, they appeared to be nothing more than competitors making chit-chat before the battle began. Were I indeed so wretched, it might have seemed strange to me that, while the town was bleeding its new inhabitants dry, the mayor allowed a free events entry to any person who wished it. That, coupled with the generous chunk of prize money for each, seems as though Eporum was losing out on a chance to make notably more coin. Adding a disqualification rule, though, that might just send the gold coursing back into the town's coffers since, after all, the only way to avoid paying out the prizes would be if there were no winners. Of course, that would be impossible, Serva replied, unless every competitor was to be disqualified under some rule. It would take nothing less, Thistle agreed, polishing a goblin dagger on his shirt as he spoke. The targets were nearly all set up. Soon, the time for talk would be at an end. Well, let us be thankful you are not such an awful person as to have doubts of our gracious hosts, Serva commented. I say a prayer of gratitude every morning to just that effect. Serva looked over at the gnome, her lavender eyes nearly shining in the light of the day's fierce sun. Good luck to you, Thistle. I intend to win. However, if I do lose, I hope it will be to you. Consider the sentiment echoed. Throwers, prepare yourselves, yelled the portly man from the table. Strike your target on my mark. Thistle pulled back his arm, felt the cold metal of the goblin dagger resting between the tips of his fingers, and let everything in his world outside the target fall away into nothingness. Fire. The adventurers not competing in the current event had been directed to what was essentially a giant pen. Railing ran along the sides, butting up to the edge of the arena and extending back towards the town, then wrapping around in the direction of the tournament. There were a few mock weapons scattered here and there for anyone who wanted to squeeze in some last-minute training, but the intent of this space was made clear by its sparseness. They were to sit still, wait their turn, and not distract from the current show. Evidently, many of the other parties didn't have a wolf in the fight for dagger throwing, because rather than paying attention to the competition, they were doing their own warm-ups. The upside was that this meant that competitors who did want to watch the competition were able to do so without having to jostle for a good viewing spot. Eric, Grumpf, and Gabriel all let out cheers after the first round when Thistle managed to sink his dagger right into the bullseye. A quick glance told them that only a few others had completed the feat, and that some had actually missed entirely and gotten themselves disqualified. The loudest cheer went up from their left. Eric looked over, surprised to see the well-armored team he'd watched yesterday lined up along the railing and hooting for all they were worth. They must have had another member on their team who was competing. It was because Eric's eyes lingered that he saw the cart being hauled along a dusty trail behind the pen. It was largely covered with a tarp. However, the mild breeze rustled the covering as the cart moved, affording his eyes a momentary peek inside. There was a flash, so quick and brief he'd have thought he imagined it, except that it was familiar. A creeping worry ran down his neck like frozen leaves falling off a winter tree. "I'll be back in a moment," he told his friends, never letting the cart leave his field of vision. "You're going to miss Thistle's event?" Gabrielle asked. "Don't tell me your nerves are upsetting your stomach again." "No, it's probably nothing. I just need to go check something quickly." Without another word, Eric was off, moving through the pen as inconspicuously as possible while still keeping up a steady pace. He flowed through the crowd without thought, which was good, because he'd never have pulled off such grace had he been conscious of his movements. Odd, Grump said, then turned his attention back to the contest. Thistle hadn't bullseyed his second target, but he'd come close. The mighty half-orc's hand still thundered with applause as the targets were changed and daggers. Retrieved, Thistle thanked the attendant who returned his dagger to him, noticing Sarova at his side doing the same thing. Once the attendants had moved on to other competitors, he voiced his curiosity. Couldn't help thinking you could save the folks some trouble and bring your own daggers back like yesterday. Perhaps, but in light of the extra disqualification rules, I've decided to handle things the old-fashioned way, Sarova replied. But calling magic on them doesn't give me any advantage, but people can be touchy about magic in a martial competition. Technically, the only events allowed to use it are magical duel and general melee. Best to play it safe then, Thistle agreed. His vision turned forward toward the new targets being put in place. This seems even smaller than last round, I noticed. About half the size of the originals, Sarova added. Makes a bullseye nearly impossible and missing far more likely. So it would appear, Sarova agreed. Makes you wonder how small the ones in the final round will be, Thistle said. Let's just focus on staying in long enough to make it there, Sarova suggested. Good thinking. They let the words fall away as their attention became focused on the targets in front of them, each no bigger than the lid of a small vat. This one, Thistle was confident he could hit. Any smaller, though, and he'd be tossing a prayer to Grumble. He wondered if that counted as cheating, given his new position in the god's employ. Oh well, even if it did, it likely wouldn't make much of a difference. Grumble was a fair god, but not well known for his attentiveness. The cart had woven around the arena, moving all the way to a building on the other side. Though the building connected to the arena and the stands near the mayor's position, it was technically outside the fence marking the area. Outer doors manned by four guards halted the cart's hollers. Words were exchanged, words too soft for Eric to hear at the distance he was keeping, and two of the guards went to check out the contents of the delivery. Doing this required lifting up the tarp and should have provided Eric with a glimpse inside. Unfortunately, the angle they lifted at only made more material flow over. The part Eric wanted to see, whatever they observed satisfied the guards, because they pulled the tarp back into position and motioned for the others to open the doors. Then when they were tugging the material back to the edge to secure it, Eric caught another flash. Perhaps the first glimpse he could have written off as imagination, given enough time, but this one he'd been watching for, a dull, red pulse of light from a barely exposed crystalline surface. For days ago, it would have meant nothing to him. For days ago had been before he saw the gleaming red gem in the goblin's camp, mere hours before denizens of hell sprang forth. It could be a coincidence, true. The goblins had hoarded many magical items in their storage hut, but the similarity between the gem's color and the blood-red tinge of the demon's skin was undeniable. Eric still heard the clacking of their claws at night during the worst dreams, and sometimes for a few heart-stopping seconds after waking. It could be a coincidence, but a twisting splitter of worry in his gut refused to let him accept that possibility and move on. He had to be sure that the gem was innocuous, or that it wasn't the same kind the goblins had found. That meant he had only one option. Eric, the former guard, was going to have to break into that building. What do you think about the size of a coin? I'd say that would be a fair approximation, Thistle agreed. Of the 6 remaining competitors, they were taking the size of the 4th-round targets with the most calm. The other 4 were raising a ruckus while the crowd was cheering and tittering at the new challenge. Likely, they didn't realize the implications of such tactics. To them, this just made for a better show. The weight of his dagger shifted as Thistle readjusted his grip, what he wouldn't have traded for a better set of blades. These were functional, and he'd overcome their rudimentary design and lack of balance so far, but the margin for error was narrowing by the round. At this point, there was no longer any need to keep score. Whatever one got in the first 3 rounds would be the deciding factor. Now it was just a matter of making it to the end. Eventually, the other for competitors realized what Thistle and Sarova already knew. No one was listening to their complaints because no one cared. The money had been collected. All that remained was to take out as many competitors as possible. Good service for adventurers was for the tavern, not the tournament. Once this sank in, they moved back to their throwing positions and tried not to let the anger cloud their focus. I wonder how they'll handle the other contestants, Sarova speculated. They've got something. I've no question on that, Thistle told her. I'm glad this is my only one. Perhaps that would have been a better strategy. I still have magical duel remaining. Thistle's eyebrow rose slightly. You do magic? Of course, I am a wizard, after all. Throwing daggers is just a favorite hobby. Thistle looked her over once more, taking note of the flexible, sturdy armor. She didn't look like any wizard he'd encountered, but then neither did Grump, so perhaps he should stay such judgments. You're quite good for it being a hobby. I suppose we'll see if that's good enough. Eric had never been a very adept guard, but that hadn't come from lack of trying. Quite the opposite. Knowing how unskilled he was, Eric had studied harder than any of the others to improve. He'd gone over the floor plans of the mayor's house, constantly searching for undefended points that needed more attention. In his free time, Eric read books on trap making and methods for breaking and entering so that he could be steps ahead of any intruders. He'd even tried a bit of lock-picking to see if he could find a way to improve the model's designs. That ambition failed, but it still left him with a working knowledge of most common locks. No one in Maple Bark knew more about guarding than Eric, which made it all the more frustrating when he'd consistently failed to keep Gabrielle from getting kidnapped. Now, stepping carefully into the guarded building, he was grateful for all that research. Learning how to stop thieves had inadvertently also given him a good background on how to be one. He'd realized that the outer doors would prove impossible to assail without drawing a ruckus, and sneaking in on a cart was unlikely since those were searched. The weak point of the structure was the outcropping that connected to the stands. There was a tunnel leading from it to a spot deeper in, a place where Eric assumed it opened up in the mayor's area. The beams and columns surrounding it were too dense for anyone to move freely through them. For that reason, the guards only walked around to check it infrequently, and then it was more a glance than a thorough scan. Eric understood. Guarding meant it was impossible to see everywhere at once, so you had to allocate your time to the places where the chance of intrusion was the highest. In this case, it meant the outer doors. Of course, that also meant a lean, nimble man had enough time to work through those beams, making his way to where 2 of the tunnel sections joined. It was still slow going, but the inattentiveness of the guards gave him the freedom needed to accomplish the task. The shoddy construction of the hastily built arena also assisted him, as it meant the sections were joined loosely, making it easy to wedge open a gap and wiggle inside. Had Appleroom spent any real time or money on their impromptu tournament, such tactics would have failed catastrophically. Thankfully, the emphasis had been on getting the structure built quickly, before the adventurers lost interest. The actual contents of the building were approximately 20 boxes, 6 small chests, and 3 carts. A quick inspection of the chests revealed they were filled with coins, so presumably this was where the prizes for those who won were stored. The boxes held various bric-a-brac, tunics and scrolls and banners, all emblazoned with an Appleroom tournament logo. Probably souvenirs they were planning to sell sometime during or after the contests. The carts held other prizes, a gilded buckler that Eric suspected was more paint than gold, a silver statue of a dragon with blue gems for eyes, and a very ornate hat with an odd mismatched design. Eric picked up the hat and turned it around in his hands. He was amazed by how truly hideous it was. Perhaps this was the fashion in the kingdom, but he'd take a good wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun at bay. With that thought, the gaudy hat shifted and was replaced by a simple one with a wide brim, just as he'd envisioned. Eric set it back down, and it took back its original form when it left his hand. The magical style-changing hat was interesting, but he was already worried about one magical item. He didn't need to mess around with a second. Then, a few feet over, Eric saw it. There was no question. It was almost exactly the same as the gem he'd seen at the goblin camps. Same dull red glow, same egg-like shape, and same shifting patterns if one stared long enough. There were, however, two differences from the gem Eric had seen previously. This gem's glow wasn't constant. It brightened and dulled rhythmically at regular intervals. As he stared at it, Eric thought he caught the slightest increase in the tempo. That, he imagined, couldn't be a good thing, because the other difference between this gem and the one from the goblin camp was that the gem currently in front of Eric was bigger. Roughly 3 times bigger. Thistle stared in amazement at the protruding dagger, barely embedded in the wooden target, yet holding firm all the same. He was sure he'd felt it slip slightly on his throw, a minor error that should have eliminated him from the game. His saving grace had been an unexpected wind gust that moved his dagger's course. Only by half an inch, but it was enough. Of course, one gnome's good fortune was several other competitors' oblivion. Only a single other dagger had found its target besides his own, one that belonged to a long-haired human several spaces down from him. Damn wind, Siva cursed, accepting her dagger as the attendant rushed it over to her. Sorry, Thistle said, don't worry. It wasn't your fault, she assured him. Thistle felt a kernel of doubt, though. Perhaps the wind had been chance, or perhaps Grumble was showing favoritism to his newest recruit. The gnome shook off such thoughts forcefully. If one looked for the will of the gods in every turn of fate, it would soon overwhelm them. Better to take things as they were, unless the deity physically showed themselves. Good throw, Siva complimented a moment later. Not really. It would have gone wide if not for the wind. Your form was fine. I think the issue is, without meaning offense, that you're using daggers ill-suited for throwing. No argument here. But we work with what we have, Thistle agreed, accepting his own blade from the attendant. He heard a rustling sound to his left and glanced over to find a leather belt dangling in front of his eyes. Alone, Siva explained. Her daggers were sheathed on opposite sides of the belt, silver handles gleaming in the light of the relentless sun. Whatever the next phase is, you need a better blade, are you? Certain, a weapon, especially one with that much worth, was a precious and personal thing. To hand it off to a stranger was quite odd indeed. I'd like to see one of us win, didn't we agree on that? Besides, I detest this town's greedy trickery. Separate them from at least some of the gold that's been spent in the last week. With all the skill I possess, Thistle promised, accepting her gift. He wrapped the belt around himself twice in order to get it to fasten, then pulled the blades from their sheaths. They were light, delicate things that belied the danger in their sharp edges. Up close they were even more beautiful than before. The intricate etchings weaving across the surface in a pattern that shifted as the eye moved. Though slightly bigger than his goblin daggers, they were easier to hold, and their balance was immaculate. Good luck, Siva told him, walking back toward the pen with other now disqualified competitors. That was when Thistle looked forward and saw the final round's trial. The good news was they hadn't shrunk the targets. Each was still about the same size as a coin. The bad news was they had tied those coin-sized targets onto the foot of two crows, each of which were squirming for freedom in the attendants' hands. A cheer went up from the crowd as they pieced together this next challenge. Still, unaware or uncaring about the ramifications it had on the competitors, Thistle chanced a glance to the mayor, who sat stalwart as he watched the proceedings. He at least wasn't celebrating, so he was likely a man who was doing this because he saw it as necessary rather than to be overtly stingy. Thistle filed this mental note away and stopped looking at the crowd and focused on the near impossible task in front of him. If the wind had been grumble, Thistle hoped that wasn't all the god was ready to contribute. The chances of winning without some divine aid were about as good as if he went one-on-one with a great dragon. Still, miracles happened, so there was no reason not to at least give it a throw. Competitors, the portly man called from the sidelines. At my signal, the attendant shall release the crows. You may throw one dagger whenever you choose after that. Both Thistle and the human nodded, unwilling to look away from the shrieking birds with targets attached. Prepare yourselves, he yelled, clearly readying himself to give the signal. Run. The voice came with such speed and ferocity that both attendants jumped, releasing their birds inadvertently. The human let his dagger fly, shearing a few feathers from his crow's wing, but otherwise missing entirely. Thistle, on the other hand, turned to the source of the noise, only mildly surprised to see it was Eric, dashing through the center of the arena, red-faced and panting. Everyone needs to get out. Now, Eric's voice carried more weight in those words than any of his friends had ever heard him conjure. What is the meaning of this? The mayor asked, stepping forward and addressing the intruder from his position on the balcony. Why have you disturbed our tournament? Because we're about to be attacked, and we have to evacuate, Eric explained. Appleroom keeps watch over these roads and has a fine militia. There have been no raiders or outlaws spotted anywhere near here. So what, pray tell, is going to attack us? Thistle winced inwardly at the words. He'd heard such phrases enough to know they had a strange magic. Words like that presented a theatrical opportunity that neither the gods, fate, nor whatever uncaring being oversaw the world was able to resist. Sure enough, the mayor had barely spoken when a huge explosion from the northeast corner rocked the arena. Demons, Eric replied, his voice hollowed by the realization that he was too late. Very few heard him over the screams of the audience members, now fighting back a fire. There are demons coming. 12. It had been such a simple plan. Exit the building, find Grumpf and Gabrielle, consult Thistle, work out what to do next. After watching for a few minutes, Eric had determined that the pulse of the gem was indeed speeding up, but it was doing so at a steady rate. He didn't even know for sure if this gem had anything to do with the demons. Right now, it was just a coincidence and a hunch. Besides, if it was building toward a detonation, then it seemed a reasonable guess that he had at least enough time left to formulate a well-thought-out plan of action. That was when he heard the scratching. It was from a cart over, the one in which the odd hat rested. Eric searched quietly, pausing as needed to see if the sound was still coming. It took some doing, but eventually he found the source in a large crate near the back of the cart. Inside were two more gems. One was pulsing a bit slower than the first Eric had spotted. The other was going so fast, it seemed almost like a constant shine. The second gem also appeared to be the source of the scratching. As Eric peered into its depths, he realized the swirling patterns on the gem's surface were far clearer in this one. So clear, he could make out an image. That image was, unfortunately, one of all too familiar claws scraping against the other side of the rapidly pulsing gem. All hope of a plan evaporated, and Eric rushed back to the makeshift entryway he'd made in the tunnel. He exited the beams faster than he would have thought possible, mind preoccupied on what was happening. This was no longer a hunch. What he'd seen in the third gem had removed all doubt. Now, he needed to warn people, as many as possible, as quickly as he could. These gems were bigger, and he didn't know what that meant, but he could make a damn good guess at what 3 of them would entail. Eric's speed was so great that though the guards noticed him. Emerging from the rafters, they were only about to shout at him as he tore off in the direction of the arena. His newly discovered speed, after years of wearing bulky armor, assured him they had no chance of catching up. Even then, the thought of being pursued might have quickened his step, were it not already being hastened by the memory of the claws scraping against the inside of the gem. That was more than enough motivation to give him speed. He broke into the main part of the arena just as a portly man was barking orders, but Eric paid him no heed. There was only one target for the former guard, Mayor Branders. He was the man who could move people along, the man who might get them to safety before things went to hell, or rather, before hell came to them. With a deep gulp of air, Eric bellowed with all his might, "Run!" The high-pitched ringing filling the ears of all present, aside. Effect from the explosion had scarcely begun to subside when a second boom filled the air. This time, there was no delay. A third followed immediately on the second's heels. This final blast proved more than the hastily built stands could handle, and a section near the mayor's position began to collapse. Many were able to scramble away, but a few went tumbling to the ground below. Scary as it was to see people falling away, it was nothing compared to the terror of what came next. Once they landed, the screaming started. Grumpf and Gabrielle raced forward from the pen, joining up with Thistle along the way, and making it to Eric's side in expedient time. "What's happening?" Thistle demanded, his voice firm but calm, despite the growing pandemonium. "Demons," Eric said. "I saw one of the gems like at the goblin camp. Followed it on a hunch and saw inside it. There were more demons. And it sounds like all 3 gems have let them out." Thistle took a breath and let the absurdity wash over him. Dealing with magic was tiresome for a logical person because it often refused to make sense. Nevertheless, time spent debating the rationale of demons popping out of gems would be precious moments wasted. It was better to accept this strangeness as fact until it could be thought through later. Right now, all that mattered was that the demons were coming. Even if Thistle had doubted Eric's deduction, the explosions and screams were more than enough to sell him on the demon theory. "We won't have long, but this time, we've at least got a few advantages," Thistle said. "Eric, go rally the garrison and the guards. Let them know what they'll be facing, so they don't go in blind. Gabrielle and Grumpf, go let the adventurers know what's happening. We've got enough swords and magical muscles to beat these beasts back before they get established. I'll talk to the mayor and try to get him to evacuate the citizens." Thistle's directions were interrupted by the sound of splintering wood. A demon, nearly identical to the ones they'd faced only days ago, save for the fact that it was over twice as large, smashed its way out of the stands and into the side of the arena. The clacking of its claws filled the air, broken splinters of wood tumbling away as it crushed them effortlessly. Among the debris, a keen eye could pick out bloodstains on the wood, answering the question of why the screaming had grown noticeably quieter. "Well then, I guess we don't need to alert people after all," Gabrielle sighed, unsheathing her axe with some effort. "You're very wrong," Thistle informed her. "Remember, these aren't just demons. They're smart, at least smart enough to work together. If we don't spread that information, lives will be lost." Grumpf snorted in agreement as he sprinted off toward the pens. Gabrielle hesitated, then followed a few moments later. "I think I know where the guards will gather in an emergency," Eric said, taking off in another direction. Thistle turned his attention up to the stands, where panic had already engulfed the sea of people scrambling to get away. He was a bit surprised they'd bought that. Part about alerting the mayor. What could one man do to direct so many people rightfully drowning in fear? No, Thistle had given them that falsehood because he knew they wouldn't follow orders if he told them the truth. A few creaking steps had brought him forward as he let out a low whistle, then yelled toward the towering demon with all the volume he could muster. "Hey, ugly. I killed one of you just a few nights past. Friend of yours, if so. I'd be happy to reunite you." The demon turned its rat-like head and looked directly at him. From the hole it had left, 3 more equally sized monsters emerged, their eyes also glaring in his direction. Well, he'd wanted to grab attention, and he'd certainly succeeded. His nimble fingers danced to his sheaths, surprised at the quality of daggers he'd found there. Right, he'd borrowed Syrah's blades before things went crazy. He hoped she had magic to find them, because he doubted he'd get to hand them back. One demon, perhaps, he might have been able to slay with his new magic and Grumble's blessings. 2 would have certainly killed him. For made what he planned seem so staggeringly stupid that part of him wondered why he was standing there. That part was quickly silenced. Thistle knew the terms of the bargain he'd struck. It was why he'd been so hesitant to take it, for all the perks and gifts that came with being a paladin. There was also an unshirkable duty attached. Paladins didn't run. Paladins didn't hide. Paladins were the shield of flesh between the forces of darkness and those without strength to defend themselves. Paladins held the line, no matter what. Thistle's eyes narrowed as he whispered a prayer of blessing, causing each dagger to glow briefly. Maybe he could at least take one. He hoped it would be enough. Grumph and Gabrielle had left a pen full of adventurers idling in a state somewhere between curiosity, confusion, and boredom. They arrived to a chorus of metal scraping against leather as weapons were drawn, armor refastened, and arrows nocked. Adventurers were, on the whole, loud, disruptive, and often boisterous to a point of spectacle. But no one could deny that when shit hit the fire, they were always ready to charge in headfirst. None of the normal folk truly understood this brazen attitude, to dive into dungeons and unexplored depths as though their lives weren't on the line if things went poorly. Whether or not they understood it was irrelevant at the moment, though. All that mattered was focusing it. "The demons are smart," Gabrielle blurted, mouth moving before any sense of eloquence could make its way into her words. Most of the adventurers ignored her, but a few of the nearby ones turned their heads. After a dismissive glance, those heads went right back to whatever they'd been previously occupied with. A familiar bubble of anger tried to rise inside her, however, she was able to push it away. Now was not the time to let her fury bubble forth. That would come all too soon as it was. "Listen to me," Gabrielle called again, forcing herself to project her voice while maintaining a calm tone. "My friends and I fought some of these monsters 3 days ago. They were organized, cutting off escape routes and splitting our forces. If you go in expecting them to be dumb beasts, you risk being taken by surprise. So, you say you fought these things before, yes?" The voice came from a dwarf encased in a dented set of old armor. A thick axe was clutched in his right hand, while his left held an aged mace. "We did," Gabrielle confirmed. "And how many of you did?" "They killed my party, all made it out, but dozens of nearby goblins were slain before the demons were stopped." "I see," the dwarf replied. "Given the way you grip that axe, I don't take you for much of a fighter. So if all your people made it out safe, then I doubt we have much to worry about. If the only things these beasts are a threat to our goblins, then I say we let them run wild." Grumph started to step forward, but Gabrielle was faster. In a whirl of motion, she jammed the butt of her axe's shaft between the dwarf's legs, shifted her weight, and spun the weapon around and upward. This knocked the dwarf's legs out from under him and sent him tumbling the admittedly short distance to the ground. These demons have claws that can cut through thick leather armor like it's a gossamer web. They can leap clear across a camp in one jump, and their flesh is as thick as a dwarf's skull. Gabrielle said, her voice only a few shades above a whisper, yet clearly audible to the many people who were now paying her very close attention. The ones we fought were half this size and still soaked the ground in blood before they were done. If you want to take this lightly, then so be it. But I'd see every warrior here forearmed with knowledge before the killing starts. You certainly know how to draw attention, said a copper-haired man. Adorned in silver armor that shone in the midday sun. The ornate handle of a long sword jutted out from his scabbard. Gabriel was sure he'd been much farther away when the dwarf made his wisecracks. To cover such ground quickly was quite impressive. I, for one, would like to hear what you know. Might as well listen, the dwarf agreed from the ground. It'll take me a few minutes to pull myself back up anyway. Gabriel nodded, waited for us. Many others as could fit to gather around, and then began to speak. The trick to getting guards to listen was to put yourself outside of a situation where protocol could be followed. There were rules for messengers, procedures for other guards, and the general bureaucratic bugbear shit designed to make sure that any information accepted came from a reliable source. Of course, that was only viable if the person giving the information knew anything. Beyond the initial intelligence, Eric found the circle of armored guards speaking in fast tones, just where he'd expected they would be, and immediately sized them up. The captain was clearly the man farthest away, with a few scars visible under his helm and an aura of command. Instead of approaching him, Eric dashed toward a guard close by whose helmet had a plume on top. "Captain," he gasped, this part somewhat genuine due to all the running, "I was sent with information for you." The plumed guard looked surprised, then uncertain, and then scared once the real captain began walking over. "What's the meaning of this?" His voice was rough like his face, and the scowl across his brow did nothing to make either less severe. "I was told to come find the captain of the Appleroom Guards and to pass on a message," Eric replied, eyes darting between the actual captain and the guard with the plume. "Who sent you?" "I don't know," Eric replied. Tall man, dark hair, simple clothes, grabbed me, gave me the message, told me it was a matter of life and death. Based on those he'd seen walking around Appleroom, that description fit around 30% of the men. More if one had loose opinions on what constituted being tall. The captain stared at him, scowl deepening. His training made him want to ask verification questions, but his choices were limited. When Eric was stating outright how little he knew, why didn't this man come himself? "I don't know. What made you so willing to do it then?" "Because the monsters were in the other direction," Eric replied. This was enough to satisfy the captain. If he'd claimed noble intent, Eric would still seem suspicious. But the captain knew that when danger came from nowhere, most folks were hell-bent on getting away. "What's this message then?" he said. These things were demons, that they were smart, and that they would work together. Said their claws can cut through armor with ease, and that blessed weapons are your best bet. The captain nodded, no expression besides the scowl, which Eric was beginning to suspect was a permanent fixture on his face. Anything else? Eric shook his head. That was it. "Fine, thank you for your service. Now, get clear of this arena quickly," the captain ordered. Eric nodded, slipped out of the circle, and ran toward the exit. Once there was enough room between him and the guards, Eric doubled back and made for an entrance to the main part of the arena. He'd nearly run away the first time, and that knowledge still haunted him. This time, he wasn't leaving without his friends. The first dagger had taken a demon in the shoulder. There was a howl of pain, and the demon reeled on impact, revealing a blade sunk all the way to the hilt in its flesh. Definitely an effective blow, though it was not the explosion of bone and muscle that had come from the last time Thistle had thrown a dagger at one of these things. Well, Grumble had said the first one was a bit special. Careful steps brought the demon closer to Thistle, the other three directly behind. Its red eye stared at the other blade in Thistle's hand, wary, but also able to do enough math to understand that one blade wouldn't stop all of them. Logic told Thistle that as soon as he let the second fly, the demons would rush him. He really needed to start keeping more of these damn daggers on him. It was a mistake he was unlikely to get a chance to learn from. The second dagger struck the demon just below its red throat, prompting a wet gurgle of pain. Left unremoved, Thistle was certain that dagger would force the demon to bleed out. He wished the kill had been cleaner, but hopefully this would make a difference. The group of monsters lurched forward now that he was unarmed, massive claws clacking in anticipation. Not that they'd need them. With their size, they'd likely crush Thistle before he landed a strike. An explosion of blue light erupted from the center of the group, engulfing all of them and washing a wall of cold over Thistle. When it cleared, each demon was coated in bits of ice, and none of them seemed as mobile or enthusiastic as before. It had been a cold spell, that was obvious, but it made Grumps seem like a brush with an ice block. "Call the daggers," said a familiar voice to his left. Serva had appeared, though he had no idea when, and trace amounts of magical light still lingered about her. "What? Call the daggers." "They're enchanted to return to their sheaths," she reminded him. "I don't know that I can do the whistle from memory," Thistle admitted. "The whistle was my signal. Just call them how you please. The magic will understand." A sharp sound rang out as the ice began cracking away, and the demons resumed their movements. Not having the luxury of time to doubt, Thistle did as he was told. "Here, boys." Sure enough, the blades vanished from the demon's hide and reappeared instantly in the sheaths at his side. This was a feature he could grow accustomed to. Thistle glanced back at his fellow competitor and noticed she was breathing hard. "Don't suppose you've got a plan. Hold them off until I can cast again," she answered. "Spells like that still take a good bit out of me." Thistle replied. There was nothing more to be said. This was his duty, after all. His dagger flew with unexpected precision this time, taking the demon right in the center of its horrid throat. There was no death gurgle, for the blade had severed all the bits used to make sound. Instead, the beast merely flopped to the ground and shuddered uselessly as its blood muddied the dust around them. Thistle whispered a few words under his breath, and the first dagger was back in its sheath by the time the second took another demon in the stomach. Between the effects of the cold spell and the corpse of their friend, the remaining creatures were showing caution toward the gnome and the elf. It wouldn't last forever, but at that moment it was enough. 13. The counterattack began with the adventurers, to the surprise of exactly no one who knew anything about them. The guards would have to make choices with the knowledge that their first job was defending the citizens of Appleroom. Adventurers, however, were under no such moral obligations and rushed into battle with the sort of enthusiasm one only finds in idiots, champions, and the unapologetically suicidal. With a roar of excitement, they crossed the arena, arriving in time to lend Thistle and Serva some much-needed support. Now, faced with targets that had to move in close to attack, the demons shifted their attention to this new prey, chopping and slicing with hellish glee. For a bit, it seemed like the beasts were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched, the adventurers felling a second of the four in mere moments. That was when the others arrived. From the stands burst for more of the large-clawed demons and nearly countless unfamiliar monsters scuttling along the ground. These low-slung, red-shelled creatures had 8 legs, a nasty set of mandibles near the mouth, and 3-foot-long tails with spear-like tips that nearly doubled their length. Unlike the clawed demons, these scuttlers drew less. Initial attention moving beneath the feet of the adventurers and striking intermittently. Less than 5 minutes after the wave of scuttler demons emerged, the adventurers' coordinated attack dissolved into a chaos of hacking, slashing, and stabbing amidst attacks from the ground coupled with the giant demons tearing through flesh. They continued to press on, injuring and eventually bringing down another clawed demon, without warning, for of the remaining large demons leapt into the air, landing on various sides of the mob and splitting the focus from a single melee to a multi-pronged attack. Had they not been ready for it, the adventurers might have taken too long to regroup, eventually costing them their lives. Thanks to Gabriel and Grumph, though, they whirled on their attackers' new positions, circling around the demons to split their attention. Bodies still fell at a faster rate than anyone wanted to see, but those left standing were bloodying the beasts right back. A slight rumble was the only warning anyone received before the ground exploded upward, showering the arena in dirt and hurling people and demons alike in various directions. From the gaping hole now at the center of the battle emerged a massive head that looked as though someone had merged a snake and a minotaur, resulting in a reptilian horned monstrosity. Dozens of thick, insect-like arms waved in the air from all sides of its armored body, each long enough to spear a human from 20 feet away and fling them to its waiting maw. This was a fact everyone learned firsthand as one unfortunate soul landed too close to it. With that, all hope of strategy was gone, and the world dissolved into blood and chaos. Grumph landed in a pile with 4 other humans. 2 of the large demons came clattering down. Moments later, mere steps away from the adventurers. Few things will drive a man up from the ground faster than the prospect of certain death, and soon everyone was on their feet and as alert as if they were waiting for a nymph to walk by. 2 of the humans, one wielding a set of small swords and one with a rapier, pressed a demon, while the other 2, a pair so similar they might be brothers, attacked the other with axes in their hands. This left Grumph the odd half fork out to determine which group to help. The Axe brothers were engaging their quarry directly, one drawing its attention while the other struck from behind. The rapier and dual blade wielder were trying a different tactic, dancing out of the demon's range and only darting in for quick, shallow strikes. Both styles might keep them alive for a bit, but it would be hard to win with either. So far, Grumph had cast 4 of the 5 spells. He'd learned that they conjured a blast of cold and ice, a small fireball, a glowing weapon that appeared in his hand and reshaped itself as he wished, and a pail of water. The ice would distract and annoy the demons. He'd seen that at the goblin camp, but fire was altogether worthless against anything from a fire-based realm. The weapon he could work with, but that spell took a lot out of him. He probably wouldn't be able to cast much more if he tried that one. Then, with a reflexive thrust, one of the demons managed to slash the rapier wielder across the gut, sending the thin man stumbling backwards. With a few whispered words and a quick gesture, Grumph cast his spell. The pail of water materialized a few feet above the demon's head, falling immediately and spilling its contents all over the monster. This distracted the demon so much that it was utterly unprepared. When the metal pail landed upside down on its head, momentum wedging it in place. Its claws, horrible and deadly though they were, proved little help in yanking the pail free. Granted, with enough time, it surely would have pulled something off. But before it had a chance, Grumph finished casting his second spell. A mighty clang filled the air as the glowing mallet clutched in Grumph's meaty palms smashed into the pail, and the head contained. Within metal bent inward with the blow, denting the pail and securing it to the monster's head. With a few more blows, and help from the dual wielder, The demon was soon finished off, a slick slurry of blood dripping down from the still-stuck pail on what had once been a whole head. Grumph adjusted his grip and turned to the next one. Magic was well and good, but only a fool ignored all the assets at their disposal. Besides, it was a magic weapon, so this counted as wizard's work. Gabrielle's trajectory sent her into a large cluster of other adventurers, along with a sizable number of the clawed and scuttling demons. With no time to wonder just what she intended to do, Gabrielle whirled her axe around and charged a group of the smaller demons. Their long-tailed blades clinked off her axe with a dull tinkling sound, and they skittered away when she drew close. One was a bit too slow, and she swung long, driving her own weapon's blade through the thin carapace on its back. She heard a sickening splatter as the small demon was rent into. With that, its legs ceased to scuttle. "They're weak," Gabrielle called to her fellow warriors, "fast but weak." "They go down easy." The others nodded comprehension, some moving to assist her while more dealt with what they perceived to be the greater threat, the clawed demons, one of her nearby. Assistants, an archer, judging from the confident way she held her bow, unleashed a flurry of arrows on the moving horde. Not every demon hit was killed, but they were at least slowed. Another at her aid was a dagger thrower, the man who'd made it to the final round with Thistle. Each blade he launched through the air pinned a scuttled demon to the ground. Their struggles stopped almost before the hilt finished quivering, a different pair of adventurers joined Gabrielle in the melee, one wielding a halberd and the other a staff. Halberd did ample damage, clearing the vermin away with pinpoint accuracy, while staff laid down small spells that didn't kill, but certainly wounded. Gabrielle took up a defensive role, since her range was shorter. She kept the scuttled demons from swarming any of the others, often having to dash between spots in order to draw attention and to keep the others safe. The five of them worked seamlessly, teamwork fostered by the universal desire not to die. Within minutes, they'd cleared out over 3/4 of the scuttled demons, and none of them had taken significant damage. That changed, not because of any failing on their part, but because of an ill-timed death on the other team. A swordsman who had been part of flanking and containing the clawed demon missed his step, causing him to stumble. The demon pounced on this opportunity, cutting the man in half with a single motion, then racing forward to assist the scuttles. Even if what was left got free, it would surely distract the adventurers fighting the claws, allowing the demons to overtake the group. This claw was particularly smart. Instead of attacking one of the people on the offensive, it opted to go for their only defensive member. Gabrielle back-turned as she swung her axe through. Another scuttle's body never saw the monster coming. The only one who did was the dagger thrower, momentarily turned around to grab more blades from his pack. He moved on instinct, no time for consideration. With one hand he whipped out a blade, aiming for the charging demon's eye while his feet carried him forward to cut off the path to Gabrielle. Only one of his attempts succeeded. A choked scream drew Gabrielle's attention momentarily away, and she swung around to see the dagger thrower with a claw jutting out of his torso. The demon had impaled him. It was now trying to shake the corpse loose. Its eyes glared at her as it swung its arm, flecks of blood flying all over the increasingly red ground. Figuring out what had happened didn't take more than a little bit of mind, and Gabrielle had far more than that. She understood that this man, whose name she'd never known, had put himself in the wave an attack meant for her. The bubbling of rage that was becoming so familiar surged as she watched his body finally slide free of his killer's arm. So stupid. Why did he do that? Why did he feel the need to protect her? Gabrielle's anger wasn't at the man for his action, or even at the demon for capitalizing. Gabrielle was mad at herself for still seeming like the kind of person who needed to be protected. She didn't want to be weak. She didn't want to be kidnapped. She didn't want to be a damsel, and the fact that she'd just become one again really pissed her off. Fortunately, there was a clacking clawed outlet for her aggression mere steps away. "Back," Thistle ordered, flinging one of Serva's daggers forward and impaling a scuttle that had popped out from under a seat. The children squealed in terror, nearly falling over as they scrambled away from it. Thankfully, Thistle's blessed blades sundered the smaller demons with any hit on the main body. Its twitching had nearly stopped by the time the dagger reappeared in the sheath at Thistle's side, and he motioned for the children to move forward once more. While most people in the vicinity of the monster's exit had been sent flying off to the side of the arena, Thistle's central position and gnome stature meant the force was powerful enough to hurl him into the stands. How he'd emerge from the pile of splinters unharmed was thanks most likely to Grumble, either directly or through the divine perks of servitude. Thistle's first instinct had been to leap back into the fray. However, the sounds of terrified tears had drawn his attention. Under a nearby seat, clutching each other and crying softly, were Mayor Brander's children. It seemed a reasonable guess that they had been separated from their father in the confusion and opted to hide. With a weary sigh, Thistle called them forward and assured them everything would be all right. Whether it was his paladin's aura or just sheer desperation, the children immediately latched onto him and agreed to come along. Navigating their way out of the stands proved tougher than Thistle expected. Between damage from the explosions, groups of other people trampling about, and the roving scuttles popping out all over the place, he'd nearly gotten everyone, himself included, killed twice before they made it out of their original section. Thistle noticed that the bulk of others he saw were moving west, and that almost none were coming back in the other direction. That meant either there was a way out or certain death. 50-50 was better than his chances if they stayed put, so the group pressed onward. The one blessing of their journey was that the scuttles they encountered moved singularly rather than en masse. A group of them easily could have overwhelmed Thistle and the children, yet they encountered no more than one at a time. Such behavior bothered Thistle, who had seen them moving as a unit earlier. Even without his blessed daggers, out of their group these creatures were weak. It made no sense for them to spread out like this. Assuming they weren't as intelligent as the claws, sheer instinct should still have kept them bunched together. Thistle wished he could have seen how the fight below was going. Unfortunately, between the debris, constant movement, and the fact that his own height was barely greater than that of the children's, he had to resign himself to listening to the ordeal below. From the sounds, it seemed like things weren't entirely lost. The majority of the shouts he heard were ones of direction. Not terror or surrender. Hopefully, that ground demon was built more for intimidation than practicality. Another scuttle popped up, this one letting out an odd chittering screech before Thistle's dagger chopped it in two. "I don't remember the others making a noise," he mumbled after calling back his blade, staring at the spot where the demon's remains were oozing onto the wood. Before he could say anything else, the wooden chunks blocking his sight to the arena below fell away, and he immediately wished they hadn't. The wood, along with the entire section of stands where they were situated, had been smashed away by the giant ground demon that was now waiting below with an open, salivating mouth. The floor, no longer supported by anything other than habit, fell away, sending them falling toward the waiting mouth. "Ah!" the children screamed, "ah!" Thistle screamed right along with them because this was a damn good moment to scream. In the back of his mind where his logic lived, an epiphany struck as he finally realized why the scuttles had spread out in such a manner. They were a detection system to find the ground demon more prey. Eric was moved the least of the four by the explosion, reflexively diving to the ground moments after having been launched in the air. As a result, he got an upfront seat for the horror that was. The giant ground demon. After the first casualty, archers and knife throwers let loose volleys of attacks, all of which bounced off the interlocking scales of the demon, leaving scarcely a scratch. The next volley was one of magic, a rainbow of different spells bouncing off its flesh. One or two seemed to wound it slightly, but the demon paid them almost no mind at all. Instead, it focused on eating more people. It would smash into stands, intermittently, tearing away sections of wood and gobbling the people who had been standing there moments prior. Occasionally, an adventurer using a melee weapon would draw too close to it and be speared by one of its endless legs. But these occasions scarcely grabbed more than a few seconds of its attention. A dull ache in his hand drew Eric out of the trance he'd fallen into while watching this vast monster. It took him a moment to realize he'd been gripping the hilt of his sword so tightly it caused the metal to dig into his palm. He wanted to do more than grip his weapon. He wanted to hurt this demon that was killing so freely. Eric licked his lips and watched the waving legs swing through the air. Maybe, just maybe, he was fast enough. Maybe he could get in close enough to swing his sword and take off some of those legs. If he was lucky, he might even get a strike in on its side. Eric took a tentative step forward and immediately felt a hand close on his arm. "Give it a moment," said a thick voice to his side. It was one of the armored people he'd watched so attentively, the dwarf with the massive club. When it goes to hit the stands, its legs slow up a bit. That's when our kind has the best chance of hitting. The dwarf hefted his melee weapon to his shoulder, leaving no doubt what he'd meant by the words "our kind." "Thank you," Eric said. "No need. This works better if more of us charge it," the dwarf told him. Eric realized that all around the demon were adventurers with their weapons out, braced to charge, merely waiting for the right moment. Most of the parties he recognized were split, members forming triangular patterns around their massive target. Later on, Eric would realize that was so that if the demon attacked an area where one of them stood, the others would still have a chance at killing it. When he understood their brutal, selfless efficiency, he would be all the more impressed by these warriors. They didn't have long to wait until their opportunity came. The demon, reacting to some unknown impulse, pulled more of its body out of the hole and smashed into a section of the stands with its head. As it did, the waving legs slowed, and the adventurers rushed forward. Eric was with them, trying hard not to think about the lives of the people in the stands. It seemed cruel to have waited for it to kill more of them, but there really hadn't been any other way. He kept his eyes on the monster, not wishing to see the deaths of more innocent people. His ears, unfortunately, were not so easy to turn away. Eric looked unwillingly as the sound of frightened children reached his ears, which is why he was watching when Thistle let out his own gnomish scream. The three figures tumbled through the air, right toward the waiting jaws of the demon. Thistle, Eric had no idea what he hoped to accomplish by yelling. It wouldn't stop what was about to happen. It wouldn't bring back his friend, and it wouldn't make him feel any less useless as he watched the gnome die. Still, Eric yelled just the same. 14. Kicking children was, by and large, not an activity associated with paladins, at least not with paladins of any god one could pray to in a respectable temple. So Thistle felt a touch awkward about the fact that his final action in this life would be sinking his small gnome feet into the torsos of the mayor's children and pushing with all his might. Before the job change, it likely wouldn't have been enough, but his paladin strength gave him the extra boost to send both children hurtling in a new direction, one that would hopefully place them outside the ground demon's range. This also had the effect of moving him closer to the demon's open mouth. Such were the ramifications of mid-air readjustments. As he tumbled through the air, Thistle pulled both of his daggers from their sheaths. It was a useless gesture. This monster would crush him in a single snap of its jaws, but he was determined to fulfill his duty to the end. Paladins always went down. Slashing, Thistle would not be the one to break that grand tradition. In the span of seconds, he'd fallen into its mouth, a wide red canyon filled with hundreds of razor-sharp teeth. The world grew dark as its jaw shut, sealing away the daylight. All that illuminated the space around Thistle was the set of daggers clutched desperately in his hands, which gave off a faint white glow. He wasn't sure if this was magic Sirva had put on them or a side effect of the blessing. He just knew he was thankful for it. Thistle flew past the first few rows of teeth, a kick-generated spurt of momentum carrying his small body through at high speeds. When he finally landed, he was partway down the demon's throat, just past its tongue. Immediately, the muscles of the throat constricted, coming together to force this delicious tidbit all the way down to the waiting stomach, before it could fully surround him. Thistle dug both daggers into the soft flesh, plunging as hard and deep as he could manage. "Hope you can't swallow right for a week," Thistle muttered, one last dash of spite against his killer before his inevitable death. With the damage done, he waited for the throat to crush him into pulp. Instead, the entire arena got a very attention-grabbing surprise. The demon's scream made nearly everyone present clutch their ears in pain. It rang out across the tournament field, causing a section of the stands to shake and collapse, then continued onward where it startled some unsuspecting birds roosting a mile away. As horrible as the sound was, it might as well have been the starting flag at a joust, because it signaled just what all the adventurers had been waiting for, an opportunity. They poured into its lair like a spilled potion, surrounding the demon as it churned and bucked, battling some unseen foe. Eric was with them, hoping against hope that if he were fast enough, somehow there would still be time to save Thistle. Maybe if they opened up its stomach, he'd still be alive and could be healed. It was a silly, delusional hope. Eric understood that quite keenly. That didn't stop it from fueling his focus as he slashed at the demon's arms with his blade, taking them off cleanly with every strike. Around him, others were having varied success. Those with more physical strength or magically enchanted weapons were able to duplicate Eric's feat of taking every limb they swung at. Others, unfortunately, required 3 or 4 hacks before severing an arm from the demon's body. Even with the beast's attention elsewhere, this left them vulnerable for too long and often resulted in them getting stabbed, if not outright skewered. Still, as they continued their work, more limbs fell away and fewer adventurers found themselves injured. Whatever was distracting this demon was doing an incredible job. All they could hope was that it would continue long enough for them to start on the body. As Eric finished off the last of the tentacle-like arms in his area, he slashed at the demon's hide with his sword, cutting easily through the hard scales as blessed metal tore infernal flesh. Thick, gooey blood oozed out from the wound, and Eric redoubled his efforts. His friend was in there, alive or dead, and he'd be damned if he allowed Thistle's final resting place to be inside some glorified demon worm. Thistle was, at this point, doing very little resting. Point of fact, he'd never worked harder in his life. After the monster's scream, one that had left him with twin trails of blood trickling from his ears, and had very nearly forced him to release his blades, the constriction had finally begun in earnest as the demon tried to dislodge the discomfort in its throat. However, for once, Thistle found his size to be a boon rather than a burden. Big as the creature was, it had clearly been bred for large meals, and its physiology reflected that. Had Thistle been a touch bigger or lacked the dagger handholds, he'd surely have been sent down the express route to its stomach and impending digestion. As it was, He was just barely able to hang on against the pressing muscles pushing him downward. While the constriction failed to dispose of Thistle, it did succeed in moving him and the daggers slightly downward, rending the demon's flesh as it went. After a particularly hard thrust, the constriction relented. Thistle took this opportunity to pull out one of the daggers and slam it back into an unarmed bit of throat, slightly higher than the previous. Wound. While it didn't result in another ear-splitting shriek, Thistle felt the creature jerk and twitch, shuddering in pain. He had no idea what he was trying to accomplish. Perhaps a dim hope of climbing back up and out of the demon's mouth fluttered about his head, but the logistics of getting past the teeth would have crushed that delusion as easily as the jaws would crush Thistle. No, this was not an attempt to survive, a break at freedom, or even some stupid belief that he could kill the demon from the inside. This was merely Thistle showing the quality that had defined him most in his youth: relentless stubbornness. It was what had gotten him tossed from his church, what had forced him to travel with a band of adventurers, and what had ultimately led to winning his wife. Pliable as Thistle's mind could be, there were just some things he absolutely could not do, and dying quietly was one of them. Had he passed away at this particular moment, Grumble would have pointed out that this trait was what made him a candidate for paladinhood in the first place. But Thistle did not pass away, nor did he relinquish his grip on the daggers when the next round of constriction began. Instead, he held on tight and stabbed again each time the opportunity came. There was no end goal or strategy at work. Thistle just intended to give as good as he got before the inevitable occurred. Of course, had he been able to hear the sounds from outside the demon, he might have entertained a very different idea of what constituted the inevitable. There was no style to Gabrielle's technique as she swung her axe, no sublime grace that others would watch and find beautiful. She was, in fact, quite ugly. Her hair was matted in blood-hot, sticky stuff that also coated a large portion of her face, a face that wore the sort of scowl one sees just before a knife enters their belly. No, she was far from beautiful as she swung downward, rending another claw's head from its shoulders and sending a hot spray of fresh blood into the air. Gabrielle didn't need to be beautiful. She was effective, and that meant worlds more than beauty in her current situation. With a heavy grunt, she pulled her axe free and spun around, searching for fresh targets. The last few minutes had been a blur. After the dagger thrower's sacrifice, her rage had broken free, sending her on a collision course with the claw who had killed him. Alone, anger or no, she'd never have stood a chance against such a monster, but she wasn't alone. At her charge, other adventurers had taken the cue, swarming the demon with her and splitting its attention. They'd tried this tactic before, however, this time they had Gabrielle, who demanded the monster focus on her with every snarl, grunt, and swing she sent its way. The demon was dead in minutes, and her newly formed party hurled themselves at the next one, and the next one, and so on, until she looked around and realized she might be out of claws to kill. At that realization, the anger ebbed and Gabrielle was able to think clearly once more. She surveyed her surroundings carefully, on watch for any threats that might leap out at her. The claws in her area were all dead, the last of them a headless corpse at her feet. Somewhere along the line, the scuttles had been broken, their groups destroyed. A few rogue ones darted about, but without the advantage of numbers or the claws, a single scuttle proved little challenge for any adventurer. She could see other groups of adventurers and guards still fighting throughout the arena, from the way they were bunched together. It seemed likely they were cleaning up the last of their demons. Truly, the final challenge was the giant monster that had sprung from the ground. Gabrielle hefted her axe to her shoulder and began heading over. "Be careful," said a familiar voice to her right. She turned to find Grumph holding a glowing spear that seemed to be made of purple light, pinning a scuttle to the ground. It was close to her, so close it could have struck had it made a few feet further. As she watched, he lifted his weapon up and it turned into a hammer, which he brought crashing down on the insect-like demon with a loud crunch. "Thanks," she said, noting that her words sounded slightly slurred. "You need rest," Grumph advised her. Anger tolls the body. She saw no reason to object. Grumph was certainly right. Already she could feel the stiffness in her muscles, the heaviness of her weapon. Hell, even taking a few steps had been an arduous task. Grumph was right. She should rest, and she would when the battle was over. Soon, she promised him. Grumph merely nodded. He understood that arguing would waste energy she didn't have. She would fight until either the battle was done or she was. That was the way of the barbarian, which Gabriel most certainly was. He would do the job of a friend and keep her safe as best he could. "One left," he said, pointing at the ground demon, which was thrashing wildly about. "Big one, though," Gabriel noted. "Big still bleeds. Couldn't have said it better myself. It was only Eric's natural grace that kept him from slipping on the massive pool of blood at his feet." He and the other adventurers had taken out nearly all of the demon's legs and turned their wrath onto its body. The hide was thick and tough, but with time and determination, they'd hacked through it slice by slice. Each blow opened up new wounds, spilling gooey blood onto the ground. Within minutes, they were all soaked in the stuff. A few minutes more, and not even the thirsty dirt could soak up any more. The effects of their damage could be seen. The demon was growing slower, its few remaining limbs weak and ineffective. Sooner or later, they would bleed the beast out. Eric just didn't know of it. Would be soon enough. Make a path. The voice rang out from behind Eric, its source a human with copper hair and shining armor, one from the group he'd seen yesterday. Next to him was the elf woman Thistle had been throwing next to, as well as a vast conglomeration of people wearing robes and holy symbols. "Everyone get clear. We're going to hit it with a coordinated strike, so move." The man yelled again, his words finally penetrating the battle fog most of the remaining warriors had fallen into. Batas gave up their frontline positions quickly. The one thing any good melee fighter knew was to get clear when magic was about. Eric scrambled away, nearly losing his footing twice thanks to a combination of haste and exhaustion. As he exited the demon's crater, he saw a growing light radiate from the group as each person there began casting a spell. The light grew brighter, dozens upon dozens of symbols materializing in front of each adventurer. Magical energy so thick it made Eric's hair stand on end, even at such a distance away. The energy grew, swelling slowly like a filling water skin. Then, just when he was certain no more could be contained, the energy burst. No one there could actually make out what the attack looked like. 25 spells detonating on a single area simultaneously was more than mortal eyes could bear to witness. What they could make out, however, was the after effect. The top of the ground demon tumbled forward, striking the dirt with a powerful thud. There was no chance of it getting back up, as it had no muscles to work with. The coordinated magical attack had sundered it clean through, chopping it down like a hideous red-skinned tree. Moments after impact, a cheer went up. The arena was filled with the sound of joyful accomplishment and relief as the monster lay conquered at their feet. It was done. The attack was over, and they'd survived, most of them anyway. As quickly as the cheer began, it halted even faster when the demon's mouth began to twitch. Swords readied, arrows drew, and the crackling of magic filled the air once more. Everyone was braced to attack as the twitching moved first from the back of its mouth, then to the middle, and finally to its lips. These same lips were pulled open slowly, not by a tongue as many expected, but by a pair of small gnome-sized hands. Thistle emerged from the demon's mouth, careful not to nick himself on the rows of blade-sharp teeth, and breathed a sigh of relief as his shoes touched the blood-soaked dirt. Looking around, he realized the eyes of everyone were on him, ogling the insane sight of a gnome emerging from the maw of a demon, never one to waste an opportunity. Thistle cleared his throat and spoke as loudly as he could. "Anyone object to a do-over on that last throw? I got a bit distracted by the demons, and I'd wager my target has flown half a kingdom away by now." The cheer he received would have been deafening had the demon's scream not already broken the eardrums of so many. 15. Night fell before any semblance of peace returned to Applerum. The corpses of the demons were trimmed, skinned, and stripped of all useful parts, then buried on consecrated ground and blessed by any adventurers who had a bit of divine connection. The remaining inventory of the storage shed, what little remained, was scrupulously evaluated. No item with magical potential was left unassessed, and anything even slightly tinged red was suspect to exceptional scrutiny. Those who'd been injured in the fray were healed with divine magic, the healers curing the poisoning in the blood that the demon's strikes had inflicted. Those who were beyond healing or already gone were mourned, buried, and stripped of gear by their adventuring party. The latter act gave no one joy, but there was no sense in entombing a friend with his chain mail when that same armor might keep another alive. By the time Thistle, Gabrielle, Grumph, and Eric returned to the inn, they were wiped beyond measuring, every bit of energy. And magic expelled. They greeted the innkeeper and staff with polite nods, slurped down a few bites of stew and rolls of bread, and collapsed in exhaustion with nary a word said among them. There would be time for talk later. All that mattered for the night was the sweet release of sleep, carting them off to a land where their bones didn't ache and their eyes weren't burned with images of fallen corpses. In a small blessing, perhaps metaphorical, and perhaps literal, none were troubled by nightmares or dreams of any sort. They slept the slumber of the dead, cut off from the world until morning came, all too soon in its arrival. As the group stirred, they became aware of a presence in their room, aside from one another. Sitting at the table, helping himself to a dish of porridge from a still steaming pot, was Mayor Branders. The four adventurers slowly pulled themselves out of there. Cots wandered over to the table and took their seats. To his credit, Mayor Branders waited until everyone had served themselves before speaking. "I do not care for adventurers," he said, his voice thick and rougher than the previous day. It certainly made sense. He'd been doing ample shouting of commands when he restored order after the attack. "I never have. I see them as flippant, uncaring folk. They ride into town, slay a few monsters, spend some gold, hit on our bar staff, then float on to the next encounter. They have no roots, no ties, no sense of obligation." The other focused on their porridge, holding back the words of agreement they wanted to speak. Mayor Branders had the same impression of adventurers as any of the regular folk, the same they'd had only a week ago. So when an advisor came to me suggesting the idea for a tournament to draw them in, bleed them dry, and then swindle them out of prizes, I'm ashamed to admit I allowed myself to be won over. I resisted at first, but because of my prejudice against your kind, I let my mind be clouded by greed. It seemed like a victimless scheme in that it would only annoy adventurers, not decent people like those who lived in my town. The group's silence continued, broken only by the occasional sounds of porridge entering mouths. Yet today, I find myself impossibly indebted to the very folk I thought to fleece. Without the adventurers, this town would be nothing but blood and ash. Every one of my decent people owes their lives to the efforts your kind put forth yesterday. This is the sort of debt I cannot ever hope to repay, even if I possessed all the gold in Solium. It was Thistle who spoke next, Thistle who had to speak next. The others didn't trust themselves to play this right neither. their minds to understand the situation nor their tongues to find the right words. Only the tiny gnome could speak for them. Only he had the talent and the respect. I'm going to make a guess that you don't intend to have this talk with every adventuring party in town. No, I do not, Mayor Branders confirmed. There will be an official release of thanks, and I will work behind the scenes to make good on what I owe. It will not come overnight. But I promise you, Appleroom will one day be a haven to every adventurer looking for a place to rest their head. Fair prices, safe accommodations, everything we can do to make their lives easier. However, I came to speak with you all because you hold a different debt over me, not as a mayor, but as a father. You saved my children's lives. It is literally part of the job, Thistle assured him. A paladin who won't help defenseless children is unworthy to wear the title and won't for long once his god gets wind of it. Knowing your motivations doesn't preclude me from repaying what you've done for me. First off, you've won the dagger throwing event and are entitled to the prize chest. I never but we both know you have the skill to make it, and you're the only one who never technically missed the throw. This is my jurisdiction as tournament official, and I'll hear nothing more about it. As a paladin, you are obliged to respect the rules and laws of a city, correct? It's a little less defined than that, but you've got the gist of it right, Thistle admitted. Then the matter is settled. Mayor Branders paused to take another scoop of porridge from the pot. A man his size could put away half the pot were he so inclined. Now, I asked around a bit and learned you lot came into town looking for supplies, lost what you had in a goblin raid. Thistle and the woman with the axe need armor. Anyone else, I could use something light, Eric spoke up. Much as he loved his newfound freedom, he wouldn't mind having a barrier between his flesh and enemy blades next time fighting started. Light, huh? I'll see what I can do. I've got people working on something special for your warrior and something appropriate for you, Thistle. Now, as for weapons, does anyone need anything? I could use a set of decent daggers, Thistle said. Mayor Branders eyed the set on his hips carefully. Seems like what you've got is beyond anything I'd be able to provide. These belong to Silva, another adventurer, Thistle explained. She loaned them to me for the last round of the tournament, and in the chaos that followed, I had to use them. As soon as I find her, they return to her possession. Quite respectable of you, Mayor Branders. Noted. All right then, I'll find our best blacksmith and put him on it. Anyone else? I need a weapon, Grumph said, his rough voice somewhat muted. He was loath to pick up a melee item, but he had to face the fact that he simply didn't have enough magic to handle every situation with spells. Yesterday's battle had illustrated his need for something to knock attackers back with. If he hadn't had to waste magic creating his energy weapon, he'd have had more power to use helping others, right? You're the wizard. If Mayor Branders felt any curiosity about the request or the fact that it came from a half-orc boasting magical skills, he kept it to himself. Staff, dagger, or something else, blade, Grumph replied. One-handed, sharp, and sturdy. I see no problem with that. In fact, I may be able to get you something quite nice. That's weapons and armor then. Anything else you lot need, aside from the basic provisions and horses? No, Thistle said, speaking immediately. You have already been more than generous. I feel we will owe payment for what has been promised as it is. You try to pay me, and I'll throw you in a cell, Mayor Branders informed them. He finished off his second bowl of porridge and rose from the table, extricating himself with great care so as not to jostle those near him. I'll need 2 days to get everything in order for you. Can you spare the time? We can, Thistle informed him. Time to rest would be helpful, and I must locate Silva to return her daggers. Mayor Branders nodded. Right, then. See you in the morning, 2 days from now. I might send people by to get measurements, so if you leave, Let the innkeeper know where you're going." "Certainly," Thistle promised. With that assurance, the mayor of Appleroom stepped out the door, leaving the party alone for the first time all morning. "I didn't see that coming," Eric said. "Me neither," Gabrielle agreed. "Good thing the mayor is a decent guy. After the tournament trickery, I thought he'd be a real rogue. Kind, maybe. Smart, certainly," Grumph told them. "Grumph is spot on," Thistle concurred. "Make no mistake, we should be quite thankful for the mayor's generosity. However, do not take his actions as totally altruistic. What is he getting out of giving stuff away?" Eric asked, favor from the adventurers. "Yesterday, immediately after it became obvious he was trying to hoodwink everyone, he was given a first-hand glimpse of how dangerous adventurers can be when rallied together. Now they're riding a battle high, short on coin, and Isley could be swayed to believe he was a corrupt mayor in need of sword-dispensed justice by making overtures of apology. He sets the tone before anyone else has a chance to, minimizing the odds of receiving several broke adventurers' wrath. But he said he was only meeting with us," Gabrielle pointed out. "And surely he meant it, but he'll have some communication with the others via proxies or messages. We will be the symbol he holds up in front of them. The paladin who saved his children and his party are the first to receive the mayor's apologies, and some recompense. It's rather impressive, actually. The man is a skilled politician. So, are we going to do anything to stop him?" Eric asked. Thistle raised a small eyebrow. "Why would we stop him? Because he's lying to everyone, so." "What do you mean, so?" This time, it was Eric's turn to make an expression of surprise. His eyes widened slightly. "I mean, who cares if he's lying?" Thistle countered. "If a man claims to love his children, builds orphanages to help them, saves them from trouble, gets them food when they are hungry, and all the while secretly hates the devil out of children, what does the lie matter? Actions are more important than motivations. Mayor Branders wants to give us what we need, what our town needs for us to pull this off, and he inadvertently helps our cause by making examples out of us. We get gear, reputation, and credibility when we arrive in Solium. The other adventurers will get kind treatment as well, plus a few bits here and there. Mayor Branders gets a town not swarming with angry adventurers. Whether he does these things out of the goodness of his heart or not, they still lead to positive outcomes. That's what matters most. You are strangely pragmatic about this stuff, for a paladin," Gabriel noted. Thistle gave a slight shrug and dipped a spoon back into his porridge. "No one gave me a codex on how to do this job, so I'm just swinging my sword in the dark. Seeing as yesterday you helped save some kids, risked your own life countless times, and aided in halting a demon attack, I think you're doing pretty good so far," Eric said. "It's a start," Thistle said, then turned his attention to finishing breakfast while it was still warm. The day wore on slowly, leaving the group to linger about the inn while resting. After lunch, Thistle left to lend aid at the makeshift medical tents that had been set up near the arena. Many had been kept from the grasp of death already, although they still needed ample healing before they would be whole once more. It was good practice, aside from being a good deed, and it was helping Thistle learn something important for any adventurer: his limits. The divine magic he drew from Grumble was far from infinite. In fact, he could exhaust it in minutes if he healed continuously. Thistle was meditating on this as he walked back toward the inn, so lost in thought that he nearly missed the voice calling to him. Well, I used to have a pair of daggers just like that." The tall figure approaching him stood out on Appleroom's dusty roads. It was taller than most of the crowd around it, for one, and the elongated ears were certainly an oddity amongst the humans scurrying about. The figure met with Thistle in front of a small wooden building, the shop of a Fletcher, judging by the sign on its door. The gnome glanced upward, and a smile lighted on his small face. "Sareva, you look well as can be expected after a demon attack." She brushed her hand on her trousers. The leather armor had been left behind this day. Without it obscuring her form, it was evident how fetching she was by human standards, by an elven gauge. She carried too much muscle and breast, and of course, no dwarf would have looked twice at her, as dwarves were notorious for appreciating women low to the ground and powerfully strong. Thistle, being a well-traveled gnome, noted her beauty with a clinical interest and filed it away in his mind. His standard of beauty had been set by his wife, and no form this side of the heavens would ever take its place. "I'm glad you found me. I've been wanting to return these." Thistle unfastened the belt clinging to his hunched waist and offered up the daggers. "Apologies for abusing your generosity. Things just got too hectic for me to find you afterwards. I never doubted you'd bring them back to me," Sareva assured him, accepting the pair of blades. "Though I wouldn't have blamed you for trying. These are the best pair I've ever crafted." Thistle's face tilted in surprise. "You made them?" "I dabble in smithing, as well as a few other crafting trades," she explained. "In my experience, making enchanted items is far easier than finding someone who is what you want. I can see how that would be. Perhaps I'll encourage our wizard to take up such hobbies as well." "Your wizard? He's a half-orc, right?" Thistle nodded, keeping his emotions concealed in the shadows of his mind. He liked this woman and hoped she was not about to say something to change that. "That's rather unique. And you had others in your party as well, didn't you? An axe wielder and a swordsman, if I recall correctly." Sareva ran the belt across her waist as she spoke, fastening the buckles and adjusting the position of the sheathed daggers resting against her legs. "You know quite a bit about my friends," Thistle noted. "You and your friends know quite a bit about demons, from what I've heard," Sareva countered. For a moment, silence stood between them, an unwelcome guest shuffling its feet on the dirty Appleroom road. Thankfully, it was sent away quickly, as Thistle let a wide grin grace his face and decided to push the conversation onward. "Shall we stop with the dancing and speak plainly? You want to know what we've learned about the demons? That, and I wouldn't mind hearing how you acquired the knowledge either," Sareva added. "I expected as much. What's in it for us?" "A sharing of information," Sareva offered, her expression friendly but her words careful. "You tell us what you know, we tell what we know. This wasn't the first demon attack, and I'd like to get to the bottom of it. It's a start," Thistle said. "Where and when shall we meet? Let's have dinner. My party has booked a private room at one of Appleroom's more pleasant restaurants, the Keening Wyvern. We can sit, eat, drink, and talk. Sundown work. Sundown is fine," Thistle assured her. Grumph and Gabriel had gone to squeeze in a bit of training after Thistle left to help the wounded, so Eric spent his morning walking the streets of Appleroom. He did this partly in an effort to stretch his tired muscles, but it was also to become more aware of his surroundings. Eric liked knowing where obstacles were, the locations of blind alleys, and places he might duck into should a need for hiding arise. In his guard days, he'd assessed these proactively, making sure he knew spots that might be used against him. Now, he wasn't entirely sure what motivated him to make these mental maps, only that he felt more secure after becoming familiar with the place. It was why he'd known the arena so well, that had paid ample dividends. As his feet carried him along the worn road that linked Appleroom's various establishments, he became aware of a very strange discrepancy from the days prior. Before, he had been glanced at by the townsfolk in the same way one might view a barrel in the path. It was there, it shouldn't be bumped into, and there might be something worth taking from it, were one the thieving sort. Today, they were giving him a wide berth, stealing glances and spitting out words in hushed whispers, Eric was no longer a barrel to them, which he viewed as an improvement, but they weren't acting like he was a traveler either. If anything, they were treating Eric like he was an adventurer. He tried to shake off the idea, but as soon as it entered his mind it took root, feeding off the fertile soil of Eric's own observations. Their behavior fit, not just based on what he'd seen others do when adventurers came through Maple Bark, but also based on what he'd done. They were curious, hesitant, and more than a little on edge at his presence. But that was crazy. Eric wasn't an adventurer, not really. He was only a crappy guard playing a part. Sure, it was a positive sign that he was fooling them, but still, was he still playing a part? Eric stopped in his tracks, nearly causing an old woman behind him to crash into his back. A disaster only avoided thanks to the distance she kept from him. He'd been so frantic with fear and excitement the previous day that he'd never paused to evaluate his actions. In the span of less than an hour, he'd eluded guards, broken into a secure building, lied to more guards, and fought demons. That sure sounded like an adventurer's afternoon. Even if he'd paused for the merest of seconds to consider what the person he was pretending to be should do, he could have written it all off as part of the act. But that pause had never come. His actions, from the best to the worst, had been all impulse. He'd done what he, Eric the guard, thought was best at every turn. When he began walking again, it was with a renewed vigor. Eric needed to move, needed to feel his body bend to his will. It was the only way to get out of his head, and right now he needed that space. He wasn't quite ready to face the revelation looming over him. He wasn't sure how one even got ready for that sort of thing. All he was certain of was that it felt good to move quickly, so that's what he did. Gabriel swung her axe rhythmically, focused on nothing but the timing. Not the strength of the blow, not the angle of the blade, none of it. This was about feeling comfortable with the heft of the weapon in her hands, about learning how each muscle through her back and shoulders worked during various parts of the swing. Soon, she would add a tension to form, making certain she knew how the grain of the wood should feel against her palm and how the tug of the axe should pull on her arms. Soon, but not quite yet, Grumph sat a few yards away, the book of spells resting open in his lap. The two of them were at what remained of the arena, which had fallen into debris and splinters not long after the last demon was beaten. The hurried, shoddy construction had barely held together for the fight. Once time went to work on the weakened supports, all but the sturdiest bits collapsed. Despite this, the arena's location was remote from the town, and there weren't many people eager to linger about, so it made for a peaceful training facility. There were others sprinkled about, but they kept enough distance to allow Grumph and Gabriel to focus. Not that focus was helping all that much, despite his best efforts and several hours. Concentration. Grumph was no closer to making the final spell in his bookwork. He understood most of the components presented, but there was something he was missing, something that made it all fit together. At first, he thought it required more contemplation, but the longer he sat without progress, the more he suspected he had reached his limits as a pretend wizard. The real ones trained under other mages, learning magic from the very basics. He'd done exceptionally well to fake it through for spells. Perhaps this was the gap that only training would be able to bridge. For it would be enough to sell his cover, he hoped. His only other option was to find a spellcaster to teach him, and that was assuming he even had the potential to learn. Grumph had poured enough mugs of ale for drunken wizards to know that very few were able to master every level of magic. The vast majority of them hit a wall that was nearly impossible to break through. It was possible that this was his. You going to sit there and read all day, or are you going to actually cast a spell? Grumph glanced up to find Gabriel staring down at him. skin shining in the sun thanks to the coat of sweat she'd worked up. The blade of her axe was on the ground, and she was leaning against the shaft as she rested. From the heaviness of her breathing, Grumph estimated she'd be able to start swinging again in mere moments. The young woman's progress was remarkable. "Sit," Grumph sighed, closing the book. "Last spell is beyond me. What about the others?" "Them I can cast. I know you can cast them." "I'm asking why you aren't casting them," Gabriel said. "Training is training, whether it's an axe, a bow, or mystical arts. Doing something over and over will make you better at it." Grumph ready to retort, and then swallowed it. She made a sound point. He'd been looking at magic as somehow different from the other pursuits he'd undertaken in his life, but there was no reason it should be. If he applied hard work and constant drilling, he could improve at it. Perhaps this was even the method needed to overcome his lack of understanding on the final spell. "Good point," Grumph admitted, pulling himself out of his sitting position and reopening his book. He marched over to a part of the demolished arena that had once held practice dummies. A few remained, battered and broken, but still somewhat recognizable as humanoid in shape. With a few flicked gestures and a mumbled word, Grumph hurled a bolt of magical cold right into one dummy's center of mass, engulfing part of it in a sheet of ice. He then stepped to the side, took aim, and repeated the feat once more. Gabriel was right. One improved through practice, and Grumph had catching up to do. 16. The Keening Wyvern was an actual restaurant, not an inn with a bar and kitchen attached. It stood 3 stories tall and offered private rooms for dining, drinking, or whatever else one might care to indulge in. It was crafted from thick, dark wood that seemed to glow in the light of the candles that illuminated the rooms. The tables were set with actual tablecloths, rough though they were, and silverware was laid out next to the plates in an orderly fashion, the way one might expect at a formal occasion. A place such as this could have never survived in maple bark. Only the mayor would be able to afford it regularly, and he had his own dining hall that was of comparable splendor. No, this was the sort of establishment that was only able to thrive in a town with lots of adventurers funneling through, dropping their gold as easily as they dropped the indigenous creatures they happened to encounter in the wild. Grumph, Thistle, Gabriel, and Eric all took in the sights of the restaurant as they entered, making note of various bits that interested them. It was quite impressive, and served to make them wish they had clothing slightly more suited to its grandeur instead of the dusty traveling clothes they were adorned in. If the woman working the front took issue with their garb, she kept it well hidden. She led them up the polished staircase to the 3rd floor, then down the sprawling hallway toward an open door. Already seated in the room were Ciro, a human male with copper-colored hair, and a dwarf with a large club strapped to his back. Though they'd shed their armor, Ciro's companions were easily recognizable from the tournament. Serva rose upon spotting her friend, offering a wide smile. "Thistle, glad to see you." "Once more, please, won't all of you join us?" The group obliged, sitting in chairs across from the other 3 and getting comfortable. In the time it took them to get settled, the woman who had let them up slipped away, shutting the door softly behind her. "Well then," Serva said, once everyone was seated, "I believe we should start with introductions. I'm Serva, as Thistle knows, and these are my companions, Goldrin and Chuff. Goldrin is the tall one, and Chuff has the beard. Pleased to meet you," Goldrin greeted. His voice was more measured than it had been the previous day, which was understandable since he was no longer rallying troops against a demon attack. "Greetings," Chuff said. He sounded much the same, but that was par for the course. Conventional dwarven behavior tended to present its broad emotional range in subtle, understated ways. To an untrained observer, dwarves might consistently sound the same, but to a fellow dwarf, There was a symphony of feelings hidden amongst the inflections of words and twitches of the eyes. Likewise, Thistle replied, "My companions are Grumph, Gabriel, and Eric." As he spoke each person's name, they raised their hands in a half-wave, half-greeting gesture. "We're journeying to see King Lyoden since we have the summons from him." Thistle knew he was offering information they hadn't asked for, but he was determined to cement their story with as many people as he could, no matter how inconsequential they might be. Lyoden is fond of tasking adventurers with dangerous work, Goldrin noted, giving his head a slight shake. "May I ask what you did to earn such an honor?" "We killed a brood of kobolds that were harassing a town, saving a royal merchant in the process. The summons was his reward to us. This time, it was Eric who spoke. Before the meeting, it had been agreed that they would seem suspicious if only Thistle seemed to know about their story. Spreading out the details would help their facade. Kobolds, do yourself a favor. When you get to the kingdom, lead with the demon slaying, Chuff advised. If you go in with a kobold summons, you'll get nothing but cellars full of rats for the first month. Despite the dwarf's strange dialect, most of the table was able to put together his meaning. "We thank you for your advice," Thistle replied. "And since you've broached the subject we're all here to discuss, shall we talk about demons?" The mood of the room quickly shifted. Gone was the flippancy and polite humor. In its place hung a cloud of severity. Serva leaned forward, setting her elbows on the table and resting her chin atop her knuckles. "I want to know everything you've seen so far. Leave out no details concerning the demons, for even the smallest one could be the clue we seek. Pardon me, but I believe we came here for an information exchange, not a giveaway," Thistle pointed out. "You have my word that we will tell you what we know after, but I want your memories pure. There's a chance my information could taint your recollections, so I beg you to trust my promise and speak first." Thistle weighed his options. He liked Serva, and she'd shown him nothing but reasons to give her the benefit of the doubt. Still, his minion experience hollered in the back of his mind, urging him to remember that words are often forgotten and promises easily broken. To trust was foolish, and worse, dangerous, but he needed what they knew. In the last two places they'd stopped, there had been demon attacks. Whether it was coincidence or they were occurring all over the kingdom, it would be foolish to presume these beasts would be the last his party would meet. Better forearmed with all the knowledge they could muster. Besides, under it all, he got a feeling from Serva that put him at ease. Whether it was intuition or the legendary paladin capacity for sensing goodness, he didn't know. He just decided to take a gamble and trust it. "Very well," Thistle said at last. "We will tell you everything we encountered at the goblin camp, where we were captured, as well as what we each experienced at yesterday's tournament." He turned to Gabriel, who sat next to him, and gave a subtle nod of his head. Gabriel cleared her throat once, adjusted her position in the chair, and began to speak. "After the goblins took us, we were stripped of our weapons and put into cages. By the time the story chain had passed through Gabriel, Eric, Grumph, and looped back to Thistle, dinner had been served and largely consumed. Serva's party had clearly spared no expense, ordering several platters of various grilled meats, ample bowls of vegetables, and even bottles of wine. It made the tale-telling go much more pleasantly. And as Thistle finished his story of being stuck in a demon's throat, the rest of the table listened with full bellies and open ears. "Sounds like quite a harrowing experience," Serva said. "I commend you for keeping your head. If not for the distraction you provided, we might have lost many more adventurers before that monster was slain." "I pride myself on keeping a level head," Thistle replied. "Now then, you've heard all we know. The time has come for you to speak." "Very well. What I have is more rumor than knowledge, but rumor that has persisted long enough that it has begun the ascension to the rank of legend," Serva opened. Over the past several millennia, the demon eggs have appeared only a handful of times. In each known occurrence, they hatch, release some variation of infernal monsters on our plane, and kill everyone within a defined area before vanishing. Wait, that's not right, Gabriel said. Demons kill until they're slain or banished. They don't just stop and go home. Normal demons, no. But as we already know, these are a special breed, Serva reminded her, usually demons are summoned through gates or magic, not hatched from gem eggs, and rarely do they show the sort of tactics and teamwork exhibited by the ones you have encountered so far. These demons are different, special, and their methods of destruction is just one aspect of it. You said these types of demons had appeared before. When and where? Thistle asked. The reports are scattered, chiefly because survivors of these incidents are so rare, Serva explained. It is my theory that the attacks have actually happened far more frequently than we realize, but because no survivors were left, it's been impossible to identify the demons as the killers. All right then, let's gloss past the wheres and whens and jump right into the meat of it. Why? What you've described is more like a wizard's blast than a demon attack. They appear in one area, kill all they see, and then retreat to some unknown location that suggests a targeted strike, not demon slaughtering, Thistle said. He's a quick one, Goldrin said, pausing from enjoying the last of the giant snake fritters. Quick and correct, Serva added. Yes, Thistle, you and I arrived at the same conclusion. From the way the eggs appear to how the demons attack, it all points to a single conclusion. These are effectively bombs sent to wipe out specified targets. Even yesterday, we saw it at work. Despite the plethora of demons released, not one of them ventured outside the tournament area, despite all the townsfolk so close at hand. The people who fled past its borders reported seeing the small demons chase them to the edge, then turn around to find prey inside the grounds. Maybe I'm missing something, but what does this really tell us? Eric asked. Nothing, unfortunately, Thistle said, letting out a small sigh. We now have a better idea of the purpose of the demon eggs. However, we have no idea why the goblin camp or the tournament was targeted. One could argue that we're the thread connecting them. Then again, in both attacks, no demon made any attempt to target us. At the camp, they went after the goblins first, and in the tournament it was a general melee. If the eggs were for us, the demons should have made turning us into corpses their first priority, even with as much as we know, that knowledge still leaves us with no clue as to why they're appearing. I must sadly agree, Serva said. I'd hope that a key to understanding the attacks would be buried in your observations, yet it seems this mystery remains unsolved. All we can do is continue searching for answers. I do thank you for your time, at least. I'm sorry to have imposed on you and not delivered results. Dinner was thanks enough, Grumpf. Sod, rising from the table, the others followed his lead, and the room became a bit chaotic as hands were shaken and formal goodbyes exchanged. When Thistle went to bid farewell to Serva, she handed him a small bundle wrapped in burlap. What's this, a gift? As a way to say thank you and good luck, Serva said. Most of the others had headed into the hallway, stretching their legs after such a filling meal. The elf and gnome were all that remained in the room of nearly empty plates. I cannot accept it. You've already been too generous, Thistle objected. Please, I insist. You've shown us a great deal of trust when you weren't obliged to. This is merely a token of my appreciation. Besides, we have to look out for others of our kind. Thistle tilted his head a few slender degrees off-center. Our kind? We are clearly not of the same race, so I take it you mean you're actually a paladin. Serva said nothing at first, merely standing back to her full height and looking down at Thistle with a smile. Your story hangs together well, but remember that real adventurers would brag more about the kobolds they slayed, adding detail and embellishment whenever possible. Don't fault yourself for making a misstep. It takes practice to get accustomed to such deception. With that, she was gone, leaving Thistle alone in the room. Gripping his gift with uncharacteristic intensity as he watched her gather up the rest of her party and head back toward the stairs. Were one exceptionally perceptive, they could make out a few muttered words passing his lips just before he left the room. "I are kind." Russell stretched his back, a series of small pops echoing from his vertebrae. He took a moment to remove his glasses and wipe them on his shirt. They were ill-fitting, and his eyelashes would begin smudging them the moment they were donned. This resulted in the Sisyphean task of endlessly cleaning them, an annoying activity that Russell privately regarded as excellent training for dealing with tabletop players. Minor comfort and vision attended to, he resumed his role as GM and began the narration. After many hours of pitched battle, you finally managed to tear through the last of the ogres in the encampment. I'll roll up loot later tonight and let you all decide amongst yourselves how to disperse it. Your characters can take a rest in the now corpse-filled enclosures, and we're going to call the game here for the night. Come on, just roll us loot now. We want some of that sweet gold Terry egged on. His plump hands clutched a mechanical pencil, one that was practically vibrating in excitement as he spoke. He loved loot like the rogue he'd rolled. Any delay in receiving his payout was deemed unacceptable. "Calm down, it's not going to be a lot," Russell informed him. This was a watch post filled with scouts and messengers, not guards. "Why do you think you were able to beat them so easily?" "Because we know how to bring the pain." Glenn leapt up from his chair, thrusting his fist into the air to illustrate his point. For someone who'd only managed to throw a few paltry sleeping spells in the battle, he seemed to have no problem laying claim to what he considered his share of the glory. "That's bullshit," Mitch piped up. Russell had been wondering how long it would take for him to find something to object to. "You're just trying to keep us gear-starved by nerfing the loot. We took out a whole ogre post. There's no way they don't have at least a few magical items. If they had powerful items, wouldn't they have used them?" On us, Tim's eyes studied the map, a serious expression on his slender face, replaying the battle in his head with exceptional detail. "We're not that high of a level, and we tore through them without taking much damage, so it sure seems like they wouldn't have very good equipment." "Stop being a GM kiss-ass," Mitch snapped. "Clearly the good stuff is hidden away, awaiting conquering adventurers to find it. Yeah, there has to be a cache of items somewhere. Maybe we could all roll our own independent searches and see what we come up with." The greedy glint in Terry's eyes spoke to the discrepancy in what his character would find versus what would be reported to the party. "If not weapons, then maybe a few more ogres still hiding from the fight that we could finish off," Glenn suggested. Russell took a deep breath, then gathered every scrap of composure he could muster and addressed the group. "Listen, we've been over this again and again. The module is a realistic setting. That means, among other things, no random loot rolls. If you want to find gear from a fight, it's going to be used against you first. These ogres didn't have much. They were a paltry scouting outpost that likely would have surrendered if you'd even tried a bit of diplomacy. They had little, and you killed them, so now that little belongs to you. What about the tournament we could have gone to?" Tim asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than wheedling discontent. A rare and wonderful change for the GM. Yes, the Apelrim tournament had lots of gear. Not to mention gold, you could have one, Russell confirmed. But you all decided to ignore the invitation and go a different path, set on hunting in ogre lands. Oh, whatever, like the tournament would have been any fun, Mitch sighed, adding a derisive snort at the end of his sentence. He said it was all competition, no killing. Why the hell would we go in for that? How about you just give us the loot we would have gotten from the tournament? Terry suggested, nodding his round head enthusiastically at the mere thought of the idea. Forget it, this is the path you chose, and these are the consequences of that choice. You find what you find. End of discussion. Russell might have been a bit more forgiving if he hadn't so been looking forward to running the tournament. It was, hands down, one of the coolest parts of the module he was using. But instead, the party had decided that competition without killing was stupid and had gone off in a whole different direction. It really was a shame. He had hated having to scrap the tournament. 17. Mayor Branders might have been a cunning politician and a bit ruthless. When it came to organizing tournaments, but no one could say he didn't keep his word. When Eric rose 2 days after the tournament, a little ahead of the others as habit from his old life, he found the mayor already waiting outside their door. The sizable man had a single bag slung over his shoulder, one with arcane runes etched into the fabric. With him were 5 attendants, all still rubbing sleep from their eyes while trying to pretend they were wide awake and ready to go. Eric felt for them. They must have risen hours before dawn to be waiting when he emerged. Mayor, Eric greeted, clasping the rough hand of the town's overseer and shaking it. Pleasure to see you this morning. Pleasure is all mine. Mayor Branders took care not to press too hard on the smaller man's fingers. He wasn't so arrogant that he thought he could easily injure an adventurer. However, he didn't want to give insult by trying. If you'd be so kind as to rouse the rest of your friends, I've come by to deliver the goods you requested. Certainly. Eric headed back into the storeroom where the others slept and quickly pulled them out of their dreams with gentle yet firm shaking. In moments, he had everyone more or less up and ready to greet the world, though Gabrielle retained a grumpy expression even as the mayor and his attendants entered. They took a seat at the table where breakfast would be served while the party stayed on their beds. Seating in a place like this was a matter of finding a spot to plop down at. There was no sense of formality to be found. I won't beat around the bramble bush, Mayor Branders announced, undoing a clasp on the strangely designed bag and pulling open the top. As you all know, I've come to make good on my promise and equip you with suitable gear. My attendants are here to help everyone get into their armor, as well as provide any other assistance you may need. Now, the bulk of your supplies and transport are outside being watched over, but I wanted to bring in the weapons and armor personally to make sure everything fit. Very kind of you, Mayor. Thistle avoided pointing out that the attendants would also serve as witnesses to his good deeds, no doubt with instruction to spread word. Throughout the town, he did this because it would have been in bad form to say something and, more importantly, because the equipment they needed had yet to be doled out. First, the axe wielder, Mayor Branders announced. He reached into the rune-covered bag and pulled out a small round shape. It was like a ball of fog clutched in his mighty hand, indistinct on the edges and shifting through the center. The mayor set the ball onto the ground and then quickly backed away. A loud pop filled the air, startling everyone save the mayor, who'd clearly been expecting it. Suddenly, a set of armor was sitting where the ball had formerly been. It was gorgeous stuff, red scales woven together to form interlocking plates. As Gabrielle studied it, she was struck by just how familiar the red color was. She'd seen it recently. It was associated with a memory that would haunt her until the day she finally died, and perhaps for some while after. Is this demon scale from the giant? It is. If Mayor Branders felt any shame or strangeness at presenting her with the flesh of a monster that had turned fellow adventurers into corpses, it wasn't evident on his bearded face. It's tough, pliable, and damn hard to hack through with anything short of a blessed object. The crafters in town have already been snatching up every bit of the scale they can get their hands on. Trust me, that armor will keep you safe. I do like the color, Gabrielle admitted, lifting the heavy gift from the ground to study it more closely. It definitely adds a bit of intimidation. From what I've heard about you on the battlefield, you hardly need the addition. Mayor Branders allowed a rare smile to fall on his lips with that statement, then immediately turned stoic once more. If it's acceptable, my attendant can help you get into it. Yes, I think I'd like to try it on. Gabrielle's own face wore a sly, understated grin as one of the attendants hurried over to assist her. The blonde and blood-red armor, she rather liked the image that evoked in her mind. If reality could come close, she'd be quite content with her new ensemble. Next, the wizard's request for a weapon. Mayor Branders pulled out another misty ball from the bag. Although this time he set it on the table rather than the ground. The popping sound was far more diminutive, a pleasant break for the adventurer's already abused ears, and then a blade sat on the table. It was somewhere between the length of a dagger and a short sword, bone white in color and slightly curved toward the tip. Grumph rose from his seat and ambled over, studying the weapon with intense scrutiny as he did. Small demon's tail blade, he announced, picking up the weapon and turning it over in his hands. Quite right. You've seen firsthand how sharp and deadly those tails could be. Thought you might like to be on the giving end of that instead of the receiving, Mayor Branders explained. Grumph gave a non-committal nod, still turning the blade over in his hand. After a moment's more examination, he gripped the handle carefully and raised the bone blade overhead. With one mighty swing, he brought it blazing down on the corner of the table. It passed through easily, seemingly without effort, and a small chunk of wood tumbled unceremoniously to the ground. Good blade, Grumph announced, pleased with the gift. Thank you, it was well deserved, Mayor Branders assured him. He reached into the bag once more and produced a sheath, which he handed to Grumph before turning his attention to Eric. Now, you were a bit trickier. Do I not get demon armor, too? I thought about it. I really did. The hide from the clawed ones is darn thick. It would make excellent armor. However, that material gets a touch inflexible when dried, and you wanted movement above defense. Thankfully, the glut of adventurers in my town means the tannery had been stocked to the brim with every kind of hide one can imagine. Mayor Branders pulled another mist ball from the bag and put it down on the ground in front of Eric. That included Veil Panther flesh. The ball popped away, revealing a thin, gray set of armor. Eric picked it up, shocked at how soft and pliable the fabric was. It felt more like cloth than armor, which wouldn't do him much good against more demons. Soft as it is, Veil Panther hide is roughly as strong as toughened leather, Mayor Branders informed him. Not useful for anyone who prefers chain mail or stronger, but a fair sight better than just the tunic on your back. Besides, Veil Panther armor still holds of a bit of the monster's magic. It blends with the shadows perfectly and makes no more noise than a whisper when moving about. Perfect for someone who likes to get into places without being seen. Places like the tournament storage sheds, for example. Eric jerked his head up in surprise, but the mayor gave him a small wink of reassurance. It seemed he knew Eric was the one who'd broken into the site, and he wasn't going to hold it against him. It was a small kindness, given what Eric's unlawful entry had accomplished, but it was still one he was grateful for. Your kindness is greatly appreciated. I'll try it on right now. As Eric was set upon by a single attendant, Mayor Branders looked at the central reason for his outpouring of generosity, the small gnome, who had been sitting there patiently while the others received their equipment. The mayor had trouble getting much of a read from Thistle, though whether this was due to the trademark stoicism of a paladin or the slightly misshaped nature of his face, Mayor Branders was uncertain. What he did know was that the unassuming body this gnome had been given belied the courage and intellect housed within it. In another time, under different circumstances, he'd have tried. With all of his might to convince Thistle to stay and work as his right hand. The mayor didn't know it, but his mind and courage were among the set of traits that had endeared Thistle as a minion to countless other wielders of power. He was also loyal, capable, and small enough to kick if he got uppity. Finally, I have armor and daggers for the savior of my children. I presume that, as a paladin, you might not feel comfortable wearing demon armor or weaponry. Thank you for the consideration, Thistle replied. While I'm not certain Grumble is too particular about those sorts of things, I'm happier not trying to chance it. Mayor Branders pulled out 3 mist balls this time, setting each one on the ground in succession. The first 2 turned into daggers, long, sharp tools that were well made and honed for killing. The final ball made a loud pop before revealing a set of gleaming steel armor, sized perfectly for one of Thistle's stature and proportions. The armor has been mildly enchanted. It will offer a slight increase in resistance, but more importantly, it should conform to the nooks and bends of your body like fitted cloth.